I've been sitting on this story for a while now. It happened back when I was in high school. I'm in my 30s now for context. Also, I'm going to refrain from using my real name and all my friends' real names in the story. You can look up the place I'm about to describe online, and I don't know if we'd still get in trouble, so it's best to avoid real names just in case. In my hometown, there used to be an abandoned military base. From what I saw online, it was used primarily during the Cold War and World War II. At one point, over 200 military families were housed there. It looked like a small community. I'm sure military bases all across the country have these small communities, but it still seemed weird to me. The village was abandoned in 1984, and it was just left that way until 2014, when it was finally torn down. I remember growing up as a kid, we would always hear ghost stories about the abandoned village. I had heard every type of story you can imagine. Everything from demonic cults gathering there, to top-secret military experiments being performed deep underground. Anybody who lives in this area knows all about the abandoned village. It was almost like a lost piece of local lore. When I was in middle school, I remember my older brother coming into my room one night when I had my friends over, and he told me that they had been to the village. We didn't believe him. He described in detail what he saw. He looked genuinely scared, but I'm sure that was just part of him messing with us. He started telling us about the church and how the church had a secret door on the floor next to the altar. He told us that he could hear moans and screams coming from the church basement. After laying it on thick for a while, he finally had all of us believing him. His irrational story just added to the already mysterious lore of the abandoned village. For years, my friends and I would share stories about this place. We always said that once we were old enough to drive, we would investigate it ourselves. All through high school, we talked about exploring the village, but never went through with it. That was for two main reasons. One, we didn't really know the exact location of the village. We knew the area, but that wasn't enough to go on. We knew it was near the airport, but there's a lot of area around the airport that has no trespassing signs. And two, even though it was abandoned, it was still technically a military base. We had no idea what kind of trouble we'd be in if we got caught. On one cool spring night in our senior year of high school, one of my friends, Alex, came to us and told us that he knew where the entrance to the village was. We didn't believe him. He told us that someone he knew had been there and shared the location with him. I was so confident that he was making it up that I told him we should go and investigate. I assumed that we would never find the entrance, so that night around 11 p.m., we made the 15-minute drive to the approximate area. Alex didn't seem confident of the location. He kept telling me to pull over. Every 2 feet he'd say, "I think this is it," but it would just turn out to be nothing. Finally, we found an overgrown road. Alex claimed that this must be the path. There was a beat-up, old no trespassing sign covered by a bunch of trees. Since we had my car, I started to get nervous about going any further. Alex and my friend Nick were 100% down to keep driving forward. Getting in trouble wasn't even on their minds. They kept going back to the same argument. We'd been talking about it basically our whole lives, so let's finally do it. They eventually talked me into it. I started to slowly drive down the dirt road. I turned the lights off on my car and basically just let the car roll down the dirt path. We eventually came to one of those roadblock gates that go up and down. Obviously there was nobody at the security checkpoint, so I had to get out of the car and manually lift the gate. This is where it started to get weird. The next minute or so of driving, we could see a bunch of furniture littered on the side of the road. Beds, dressers, tables, basically anything you could think of. Then we got to another roadblock gate. This time I had Alex get out and lift the gate. After that final checkpoint, we were in the village. It was a surreal feeling. After all the years of hearing about this place, we were finally there. It looked like being in the Upside Down from Stranger Things. It was like a small neighborhood, but it just looked wrong. You could see that it was decaying. I pulled the car in front of the church. We all got out and quietly started to explore the area. The first thing I noticed was that there were no cameras anywhere that I could see. That made me feel a little better that maybe we wouldn't get caught. We went to the church first, and it was creepy. There was graffiti everywhere. I looked for the door my brother mentioned when I was a kid, and it was no surprise that there was no trapdoor. After exploring the church, we went and looked at some of the houses. It was so creepy. It was legitimate housing, and it just looked completely abandoned. Some of the housing units looked like they'd been hit by a hurricane, while others were still intact. The housing that was intact was more creepy than the messed up units. Our friend Scott was with us, and the entire time he was freaking out. He kept claiming that someone was there. Scott was always afraid of something. We kept telling him that it was just because of the nature of what we were doing, that his imagination was probably playing tricks on him. While in one of the houses, we all stopped abruptly because there was an unnatural sound. What I mean is that it didn't sound like a typical noise a house makes. I asked my friends if they had heard it, and they all had. It sounded like wood creaking, like the sound it would make if someone were walking on the wood. Instead of continuing to listen, Alex shouted asking if anyone was there, and the noise stopped. We all stood in that house for a minute trying to talk about what we had just heard. I truly didn't know. Alex and Nick were sure that it was just an old abandoned house making noises, not Scott. He was sure that we weren't alone. Either way, I told the group I wanted to leave. I had such an uneasy feeling being there, and I just wanted to go home. I could tell Alex and Nick wanted to stay. Since I drove, I told them that we were leaving. While we were heading to the front door, Scott jumps back suddenly. He quietly pointed to one of the windows on the side of the house. 3 shadows can be seen moving on the outside of the house that was next door. We all became dead silent. Those were clearly the shadows of heads that were moving just outside the window. As quietly as I could, I stepped over to the window and looked outside. I could see the shadows move just out of sight into the backyard of the house we were inside. I whispered as quietly as I could that we needed to make a run for the car. Everyone nodded. Without thinking, we all just sprinted right out the door and in the direction of my car. Once the car was in sight, Scott, who was in front of us, screamed at the top of his lungs. We all looked, and standing next to the back seat of my car was a tall woman with a disgusting old black dress on. She had the back door open, and it looked like she was about to get into the vehicle because one leg was already halfway into the back seat. When she heard Scott scream, she let go of the door and ran inside the church. We continued running towards the car. When we got there, I looked in the back seat, and thankfully, nobody was back there. We got into the car and drove off as fast as we could. I remember going so fast that I lost control on the dirt and almost crashed the car. That night, we shared stories about who we think we encountered. The most obvious answer is that those people were likely homeless in some capacity and using this abandoned facility as a shelter. All of that makes sense, except for why that woman would be trying to get inside my vehicle. It's also terrifying when I think about that night because we walked around for quite a while and never saw anybody, or even a clue that somebody had been there. Not until right before we left. Even though Scott claimed that he heard something weird, I still think that was just his imagination at that time. Years later, I started telling my girlfriend the story. She said we should look it up and see if it's still there. That's when I realized that it had been torn down in 2014. It's wild that there's so much more information on it now. Growing up, we constantly tried looking stuff up about that place, and there was nothing. Because of that, it added more to the mysterious lore of the abandoned village. I'm just happy we left when we did, and that Scott screamed when he saw the tall woman. If we had been 10 seconds later running to the car, who knows how this night could have ended. When my wife and I first started dating, we were reckless. Not in a way that harmed anyone directly, but we did some things that I would never do now. Things of questionable legality, in other words. For example, we would explore abandoned buildings and houses trying to find proof of ghosts. I never bought into any of that stuff. That was more of her deal, and I just went along with it because I liked the girl. Out of all the houses and buildings we explored, only one time was I left at a loss for words. I couldn't explain then what I saw, and I don't think I can explain now what I saw either. It was an extremely dark night outside, one of those cloudy nights that just makes everything feel so much darker. She had found this house that was not near anything. It was an old house that barely looked like it was standing. I was always sketched out to go inside these houses, not because I was scared of ghosts. I was sketched out to go inside because I never knew if these houses were going to collapse when I was inside. This house was in particularly rough shape. I had to kick down the front door, which was boarded up. Inside the door was what I assumed used to be a living room, except it was missing half the floor. In the middle of this room was a giant hole where the floor used to be. We took our flashlights and looked down the hole, and you could see what was left of a basement. I kept telling her that we should probably leave because this place clearly isn't safe. She didn't care. She kept telling me just to wait a minute. That was always her go-to line whenever I wanted to leave. She was sneaking around the house watching for holes, and I just stayed by the front door. I told her I was staying there because I didn't trust the floor. She laughed and called me a coward. A few minutes went by, and my curiosity got the better of me. I made my way into the other room where she was. The room was a mess, junk stacked to the ceiling. She was going through all the stuff, trying to find remnants of the people who lived there. That was part of her routine. I wanted no part of that. She told me to check the upstairs. She must have known I didn't really want to do that because before I could even respond, she said that the sooner we search the entire house, the sooner we can leave. Reluctantly, I made my way upstairs. At any moment, I was sure I was going to fall through the floor. There was a room directly to the right at the top of the stairs. I went in there first. It was an old bedroom with a bed still in there. It was kind of depressing. The bed was still made, and on the bottom of the bed was a folded up bathrobe. It was like somebody just disappeared and left their home as is. I continued looking around the room, and it was just more junk everywhere. A lot of clothes, some old knickknacks that were falling apart, and furniture that looked like it might break if you touch it. There was this weird crawl space in the corner of the room. Sometimes we'd find treasure in these crawl spaces. I went inside, and it was weird. It was filled with a bunch of baby stuff, like unopened boxes of diapers and baby food. But the stuff was old, like really old, and covered in dust and cobwebs. Some of the baby food had clearly been gone through by rodents, not to mention it smelled horrible. Just as I was about to leave, I thought I could hear the sound of creaking. I used my flashlight to look around the entire crawl space. In the corner of the crawl space was another little opening. I couldn't believe I missed it a second ago. I crawled over and looked down the opening. It was a narrow path that looked like it went directly across the length of the house to the other bedroom. The creaking sound was clearly coming from down that way. I was a little too big to crawl down the narrow path, so I left the crawl space and started heading toward the other bedroom from the top of the stairs. The other bedroom was down the hall and to the left. As I got closer, I could still hear the creaking sound. It was getting louder the closer I got to the bedroom. My heart was racing, but not because I was scared. I was completely ready to be jumped by a horde of raccoons. When I was just a couple of feet away from the doorway, the sound was clear. I quietly walked through the doorway, and I almost fell over. A woman was sitting in a rocking chair, staring out the window. I didn't say anything at first. The back of the chair was facing me, so I could only see the top of her head and what looked like a long skirt on her legs. Slowly, she just rocked back and forth. I was trying to see the reflection of her face in the window, but it was just too dark to make out any details. I took one step toward the woman, and the floor creaked. Once she heard that noise, she instantly stopped rocking. I started to apologize and told this woman that we didn't know someone lived there. Before I could say anything else, she started to rock again, almost like she was completely unfazed that I was standing there. For some reason, instead of running, I took another step forward and asked if the woman was okay. As I took that step, she stopped rocking again. Then she stood up slowly. When she was standing in front of the rocking chair, I heard her voice. She didn't say anything. Instead, she just made this noise. It was like a low hum. Then, out of nowhere, she quickly turned around to face me. It made me jump, and I turned around and ran. I wish I could describe what I saw, but it happened so fast that I didn't really see any details of her face. All I could tell was that she was old and her skin looked wrinkled. I ran downstairs screaming that we needed to leave. I tried telling my girlfriend that we weren't alone and that somebody still lived there. She just laughed. She was so confident that I was messing with her. I was pleading with her that we needed to leave, that someone was upstairs in the bedroom. Instead of listening to me, she wanted to see for herself. I begged her not to go upstairs, but she didn't listen. I was screaming at this point to please leave, and she just continued to ignore me. I followed her upstairs and watched her make her way to the bedroom at the end of the hall. When she got to the doorway, I heard her say, "Oh my God." I ran to the end of the hallway just in case, and as I got to the doorway, she just started to laugh. Inside the room was the rocking chair, but no woman. She asked if I was scared of the rocking chair and continued to laugh at me. I told her that there was a woman there just a minute ago, but she just kept laughing at me. She went into the room and looked all around. There was no old woman. I swore to her that I saw an old lady, but she just continued to laugh at me. She walked by me and left the room. As she walked away, she said we could leave. We were both walking towards the stairs, and then we both heard it. The creaking sound again. The sound of the rocking chair going back and forth. She looked at me and froze. There was no doubt about it. It was clearly the sound of the chair. She mouthed the words to me, "What is that?" as we both stood at the top of the stairs. She took a few steps toward the bedroom and could hear the woman humming. It was like she was humming a melody. She got to the doorway and saw with her own eyes the rocking chair with someone sitting on the chair and humming to herself. She didn't engage with her. She just turned and ran, and we both ran out the door after that. She started screaming once we got to the car. She kept asking what the hell we just saw, and I didn't say anything. I wanted to look back at the house as we drove off and look at the window to see if I could see anyone standing there, but I was too terrified. I truly have no idea what we encountered that night. Maybe I really did have a brush with something paranormal. I know how unlikely that is, but who knows? Maybe that kind of thing really does exist. I suppose it could have easily just been a very old woman who still lived inside a filthy and decomposing house, but I don't fully buy that. I mean, the door was boarded up, and there was a giant hole in the living room. Not exactly ideal living situations. Not long ago, I brought this story up to my wife and asked her if she remembered. She obviously did. We drove to the abandoned house, and it had been torn down. There was no house there. Not even any remnants of a house. I try to replay that night in my head all the time. I try to remember what I can about that woman's face. I tell myself that it was just an old woman, but something in my gut tells me that's not the case. When I was in middle school, my family and I moved to a new house. It was an awesome house to be a teenager in. It was bigger than our last house, and the neighborhood was filled with a lot of kids my age. Just about everything was great about this new place, except for our one neighbor. It was the classic mean old man. We would go outside and play two-hand touch football, and if we even got within a couple of feet of his front yard, he would go crazy. He'd start banging on the window and screaming from inside the house that we need to get off his property, even though we never actually went onto his front yard. As an adult, I understand the feeling of unwanted kids on your property. The difference in this situation is that we were good kids and respected his wishes. That didn't matter. As we'd walk outside, he would instantly start banging on the window and yelling at us to get away from his house. It was like he was watching for us all the time. It was brutal. This went on for about 6 months after moving into the new house. One day, we noticed that he had stopped banging on the window. We didn't hear him or see him. I remember joking that he must have died. Why else would he finally leave us alone? Another month or so later, my friend Joel stayed overnight. We woke up in the morning when it was still dark out. I don't recall the exact time. We heard a bunch of commotion coming from next door, and we could see siren lights shining through the window. We got up and looked out the window, and right at that moment, we saw 2 people bringing out a zipped-up body bag. We knew right away what we were looking at. I remember feeling a little messed up by this. I'd seen this thing a million times in movies, but never in real life. I'll never forget that feeling of guilt. We were joking about this guy dying, and he really did pass away. I couldn't stop thinking to myself that he must have died over a month ago, and they just now found him. I didn't know that for sure, but something in my gut told me that was the case. After the old man's death, the house remained empty. Well, not completely empty. I guess the correct answer would be abandoned. All the old man's stuff remained in the house, and the house just lay uninhabited for years. Apparently, the old man did have one son, but he lived in another state and didn't even bother to come back after his father passed away. It's actually sad when you think about it. Over the next few years, I would sometimes stare out my bedroom window and just look inside the abandoned house. His house was directly next door, and from my bedroom window, you could clearly see into the house. It was so creepy. Knowing that this guy died somewhere in there always gave me the chills. For the next few years, I would always joke around with my friends. I would tell them that the place was haunted. My friend Joel, the one who witnessed the body bag with me, was one of those guys who was always scared. Every time I had people over to the house, I would tell Joel that I'd seen the old man's ghost. He would cover his ears and tell me to shut up. Everyone would always laugh. I enjoyed being a troll in high school, especially when I had an audience. One night, Joel had enough of the trolling. He dared me to go inside the abandoned house. I didn't love the idea of breaking into the place, and that's what I told him. Joel started to troll me now, calling me a coward and a few other choice words. I thought about it for a second, and I honestly didn't think it would be that big of a deal if I took a quick stroll through the old guy's house. It had literally been empty for a few years at this point. Nobody would even notice if I broke in. I made my way over to the house. I tried to walk inside, hoping that maybe the door was unlocked. Of course, it wasn't. I tried kicking the door down, but I weighed about 130 pounds at the time, so the door was not budging. Next to the front door was a small window. I tried to pry it open from the outside, but to my surprise, it wasn't locked. It slid open easily. I looked back one time just to make sure nobody was watching me enter the house through the window, and then I entered. The first thing I noticed when I entered the house was the smell. It literally smelled like death. I started to gag. I had to put the collar of my shirt over my nose. In addition to the smell, it was creepy in there. Everything was exactly how this old guy had left it. In the living room next to his recliner was a book with a bookmark still in the middle of the book. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's where the smell was the worst. If this guy had been dead for a while in the house, like I thought before, I was thinking that he probably died in the kitchen. He had a small table in there, with a sweater on one of the back of the kitchen chairs. In front of that chair was a coffee mug. The stove had dusty pots and pans on the burners. I checked to see if something was in them, but they were empty, except for a lot of dust. I left the kitchen and entered a narrow hallway. The first room to the left was the room I was able to see from my bedroom. I entered the room and looked out the window. All my friends were in the window waving at me. Joel looked shocked that I was still inside. While I was waving back at them, I heard a loud bang come from the other side of the house. It wasn't subtle either. It literally sounded like a person banging into the wall. I stood completely still. I was trying my best to focus my hearing, but there was no follow-up noise. I looked back at my friends, and they looked confused, almost like they didn't know why I was just standing there. I was creeped out now. Just the weirdness of this entire situation had me feeling off. Even though there was still more of the house to explore, I was all done. I quickly made my way to the door, unlocked it, and let myself out. When I got back inside my house, I told my friends about what I saw and how terrible the smell was. We talked about it for a little while, but ultimately, we moved on quickly after that. That night, after we all fell asleep, Joel woke me up. I asked what he wanted, and he told me he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing weird noises from next door. I dismissed him right away and told him to go back to bed. I tried telling him that his mind was playing tricks on him because of what I told him about the noise. He didn't say anything. In that quiet moment, I heard a weird noise. Joel perked up and told me that's the noise he kept hearing every few minutes. I admit, it was weird. It was like two loud knocks. I sprang up and looked out the window toward the old man's house. It was dark, and I could barely see anything. Joel looked terrified and asked what was standing in the doorway of the old man's room, the room I had been in earlier. It looked like a silhouette of a person. I dismissed it at first, telling Joel it had to be a coat rack or something. Then Joel became erratic. He screamed no way. He swore that he had just seen the silhouette move. His erratic behavior woke up my other friends. They all looked out the window and agreed with Joel. I told them that there was no way a person could be standing there. Obviously there was some type of shadow or something else that we just couldn't explain. While we were arguing among ourselves, Joel screamed again. This time he didn't say anything, he just pointed. I looked out the window, and now standing directly in front of the old man's window was a figure. Whatever it was, it had moved from the doorway to the window. It was still too dark to make out any details, but because of where he was standing, you could clearly see now that it was a silhouette of a person. We all started to freak out. We had no idea what we were looking at. While I was watching this figure, it started to move. I was able to see it walk back towards the doorway until it completely faded back into the darkness. I continued looking out the window for several more minutes, but nothing happened. I had no explanation for what happened. I remember telling my friends at the time that it must have been just the old guy's son finally coming back to the house. It was the only thing I could do to get my friends to somewhat calm down in that moment. We spent the rest of that night constantly looking out the window every few minutes, but we never saw anything again. It was about a year after that I finally met the old man's son. He showed up with a dumpster and gutted the entire house, then he sold it right after. My dad talked to the guy for a while, and he told my dad that he had a horrible relationship with his father. It took him years to finally get to the house and sell it. To this day, that is still the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen with my own eyes. I'm happy that I had several witnesses with me that night who all saw the same thing as me. I know sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, so it's validating to have other witnesses who saw the same exact thing. My friends and I still try to get together once a year, even though we all live in different states now. Every time we're together, the story comes up again. I have no idea what I saw in that old man's abandoned house that night. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for what we saw, but I just have no idea what it is. I grew up in North Pennsylvania in a small town called Wellsboro. It's surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was a big deal there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half the town would be out in the woods. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12, and by the time I was 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember because there was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 a.m. while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards out, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Around 8 a.m., I saw movement near that stand. At first, thinking it was a deer, I was dead wrong when I saw it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't in camo. He was wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still, and he was looking in my direction. I didn't know if he saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't say it was a friendly, smiley wave, more so a wave like he was just letting me know he saw me. I gave a small wave back, thinking maybe he was just another hunter who didn't have proper gear. After maybe a minute, he stepped behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away, but he didn't come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the woods, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and maybe still hunt a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed, except for my own tracks walking in. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, expecting maybe he climbed it, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of snow on it that didn't look disturbed. That made no sense. I remember feeling my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed something tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a strip of orange hunting vest material tied in a knot. I was thinking maybe someone marked a trail, but then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. That was the first time I considered just leaving. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale like he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick, until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He didn't say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he didn't answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast. In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time they weren't just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground, but the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I don't condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way like markers, or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly, like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just didn't stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore either. Definitely not in grounds I'm not familiar with. Anything can happen when you're all alone out there, yet not actually alone. This story takes place in November of last year when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company, so when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go. I will say, I personally don't like hunting, but I love to camp, and I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not? I love exploring new places. So I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long dirt road through the woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father built it and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see that. It was so peaceful inside the woods I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked dinner for the night. Everything seemed normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a scratching noise coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing. We didn't see anything for a couple hours, so we decided to take a nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look at the tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the whole time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa. He looked through his binoculars, and right then, a herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about and that it was just wildlife. I was irritated to say the least. I know what I saw, and it looked like someone, or at least something. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we needed to head into town to get some supplies, so we hung the deer up and left for the store. When we got back, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our ARs and went out scouting. We were talking for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again. The second it realized I noticed it, it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to yell for my grandpa, so I did a light whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the woods with his gun raised and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa okay, but he told me the coyote noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice. We sat there for a moment before we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense heavy footsteps and heavy breathing coming from behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and breathing right outside the door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple times. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple times. It must have heard whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Kyle had been asking Connor and I for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and somehow look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before and almost never saw anyone else. I'm being honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was this: we would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, so I'll do my best to use hunting terms and whatever. Connor agreed to the trip because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like a good story later. I agreed because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO is strong with me sometimes. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk without making as much noise, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we got to the area he wanted, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school stuff, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a tent. It was a rare, honestly amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened like a dog, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said foxes can make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. I wanted the fox thing to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed as before. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time, it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away, if that. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Then Connor called out, asking if someone needed help out there. I said that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stared into the woods and listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen yet. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered. Then he said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. He didn't say why, but it was obvious. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles nearby. I barely slept that night. Every little noise my brain picked up on. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and cold enough that I didn't want to leave the sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of the tent. Right away though, I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and one of the coolers had been turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had definitely been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung everything properly, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek and on a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably wasn't that much farther in. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up, but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon, even he had settled down. There's something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood, whether you wanted to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I only heard the crack of the rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable work. Once we got there, he started field dressing it and then showed us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. Side note, I grew up an animal lover because of my parents, so the idea of me going on a hunting trip was already kinda crazy. Kyle was in his element though. He explained every part of it like he was teaching a class, and by the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because I think Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. That wasn't our originally planned dinner. It was just a celebratory meal, if you'd call it that. I have to admit, it tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a fun close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than that first scream the night before, but the second I heard it, I felt an uncomfortable feeling inside me. Like, this again? We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us the way it had the first night. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it look even blacker. I remember the feeling that whoever was making that sound could probably see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything at all past the trees, and that made me uncomfortable. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear it in his voice that he cursed under his breath. Then, in this weird burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and I think because all three of us had been drinking enough that our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last, because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside of the edge of camp, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I think we all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light left was a weak little glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We got into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, of course. I could hear little sounds from the woods, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was inventing. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running, fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was terrified that it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still for the last time. That silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore in a normal sense. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. All these sounds were so amplified, it felt like so much was going on. The footsteps got farther and farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in the shaky voice I had never heard from him before. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent and that there was no way we were staying in separate tents after that. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle just said he didn't know flat out. Hours passed like that. Every so often, one of us would think we heard movement and everyone would go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off at some point. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple things were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans had been stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road again, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air, like one of the Tatooine warriors from Star Wars. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, they would have answered us either night when we yelled back. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs or someone trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who the actual knows what the explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I could see a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help. And the way she looked right at me gave me chills, even now. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains, and wondering what that dream was about, if it was my brain telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all of that, there really had been a person out there and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on. This happened when I was 15 years old. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I wasn't old enough to get many on-the-books jobs, so I would occasionally babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and found an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. The post explained that she worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep before I arrived and would remain asleep most of the night. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like an easy job. I emailed the woman and got a response about an hour later. She asked for my phone number and called me that evening, and she sounded completely normal. She spoke calmly and answered all my questions. She explained that she had to leave for work before I would arrive, so she would hide a key outside the house. She told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before agreeing to anything. The woman spent several minutes speaking to my mom on the phone. Whatever they discussed seemed to satisfy my mom because afterward, she told me it sounded like a great idea. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by large trees. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed every light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked to the front porch and checked the hiding spot the woman had described. The key was exactly where she said it would be. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. After setting my backpack down, I turned around and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. Inside was a pretty standard house at first glance. There were family photos on the walls and a few toys sat near the living room couch. I saw a pink backpack leaning against a chair. There were kids' drawings attached to the fridge with magnets. Everything seemed ordinary. Still, I wanted to know the layout of the house, so I walked through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway leading towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. What I was not expecting to see was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window looking out it, but that fact quickly made the sight more unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing to look at. I stared for several seconds before finally speaking. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was a smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth were missing. I asked who he was, and his smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed out of the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She answered after a few rings, and I explained that there was a man in one of the bedrooms. She sounded confused for a second before acting like she suddenly remembered. That part of it really still sticks with me. Then she explained that it was her brother who had dementia and sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he's harmless. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. If her brother was living there, he should have been mentioned in the ad or on our phone call. Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there for another minute just contemplating my situation. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing remained open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me nervous. I continued farther down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one. Locked. I tried the second one. Locked. The third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The room appeared empty. I couldn't see much because the lights were off. I pushed the door a little farther. It was just an empty room. Feeling stupid for being scared, I continued toward the guest room. As I passed the fridge again, I noticed something strange. The drawings attached to it looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of the drawings had dust sitting on top of the magnet holding it in place. The backpack I'd seen earlier looked faded too. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually been in that house was. The thought made me uncomfortable. I realized that despite being there for almost half an hour, I still hadn't seen a single sign that Rose currently lived there. I hadn't heard her, and I hadn't seen her room. I hadn't even seen any recent toys. I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a small room. I set my backpack on the floor. Then I noticed something. There was no lock on the door. As I turned around to look back into the hallway, there was the man again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He was looking at me again, and his smile came back on his face. I hadn't heard him approach. It was like he just teleported there. I honestly don't know how long he had been standing there. The missing tooth was visible even from where I stood. For several seconds, we stared each other down, me looking at him like he was some confused animal and not even an actual person. Then I quickly stepped inside the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm myself down. I knew well of dementia from a young age, as my great-grandmother passed away with dementia. This allowed me to justify this man's actions, but deep down, I knew something felt wrong. I called my mom 3 times until she finally picked up. I told her of the situation I was in, from the unannounced brother with dementia to the fact that I couldn't even find the child in the house. For a few moments, she was silent. Then she told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing that made me feel relieved and scared at the same time. Scared because even my mom thought something was up here. She hung up after she said she'd be there as fast as possible. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer until they stopped directly outside the door. Everything went silent, and I stared at the doorknob. I checked my phone, and the woman still hadn't called back to see if everything was okay. I decided to call her myself, but after 3 attempts, she never picked up. While I was waiting, the bedroom door opened a few inches. I couldn't see who was standing outside. The opening wasn't wide enough. I sat there staring at it. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was on the other side didn't enter. I knew it had to be the brother. It was those final, tense seconds where I decided I was getting out of there, and I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I crossed to the other side and kept going. I ended up nearly a block away before finally slowing down. I pulled out my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, a text message appeared. It was from the woman's number. The message simply asked where I was going. I immediately looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside or at the windows. I didn't see any cameras when I entered the house, yet somehow she knew I had left. That was when I became convinced something was seriously wrong. I called my mom and told her not to come directly to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, she pulled up. I jumped inside and locked the door, and we left immediately. Neither of us ever contacted the woman again. I never figured out who the man really was. I never figured out if Rose actually existed. I never figured out why all the bedroom doors were locked. There's a slight possibility that it was all real and that I was just extremely paranoid and dipped out, but the chances of that are slim to none. Something weird was going on in that house. When I was 15 or 16, I got a summer job cleaning units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through the property manager, who I used to babysit for, and for a high school student, it paid surprisingly well. The job was simple. Whenever a tenant moved out, we would go in and clean the unit to prepare it for the next family. Many of the units had been abandoned in a hurry. Belongings were often left behind, and some places looked as if people had simply gotten up and left one day. I worked alongside a university student I'll call Jen. She was about 20 or 21 and naturally took the lead while I followed her direction. One day, we were assigned a unit on the end of a row. The layout becomes important, so I'll explain it briefly. When you entered through the front door, you walked into the living room. On the right side were 2 sets of stairs, one leading up to the second floor and one behind a door leading down to the basement. The basement stairs turned twice, meaning you couldn't see into the basement from the main floor. The basement itself was just one large unfinished concrete room with a washer, dryer, furnace, and a single hanging light bulb. There were no closets, side rooms, alcoves, or places to hide. When we entered the unit, it was obvious the previous tenants had left in a hurry. The kitchen was filthy and most of their belongings were still there. We spent the first part of the afternoon packing everything into garbage bags and sorting items that could be donated. Once that was finished, we started cleaning. Part of the kitchen cleanup involved pulling the oven and fridge away from the walls and cleaning them thoroughly. We also removed the drawer underneath the oven. When it came time to put it back, we discovered the rails were damaged and it wouldn't slide in properly. For reasons that made sense at the time, Jen and I stood on opposite sides and kicked it until it wedged itself back underneath the oven. When we tried pulling it out again, it wouldn't budge. We both immediately regretted doing that, but we figured the property manager could deal with it later. After that, we split up. Jen headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms while I stayed downstairs removing the glass light fixtures so I could wash them. I was standing on a ladder in the living room when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I called back, to no response. I climbed down and went upstairs. When I found Jen, she was cleaning a bedroom with headphones on. I asked what she wanted. She looked confused. "What, did you call me?" I said. She laughed and shook her head. "No." I shrugged it off and went back downstairs. One thing that always bothered me about that unit was the attic access above the staircase. It was just a square opening in the ceiling leading into a dark crawl space. The cover was missing, so every time I walked underneath it, I found myself looking up into a square of complete darkness. A few minutes later, I heard my name again. This time when I called back, Jen immediately yelled from upstairs, saying, "I didn't call you, you're hearing things." At the time, I agreed with her. It was strange, but I wasn't frightened. Not yet. A little while later, I was standing at the kitchen sink cleaning the light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge and nearly tripped. The oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the floor. Immediately, I thought it was odd. Jen and I had practically kicked the thing into place. We'd also confirmed afterward that it was completely stuck. Still, I just kicked it back in. It took several hard kicks before it wedged itself under the oven again. To make sure, I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing, it was stuck. Satisfied, I went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I turned around again and almost tripped. The drawer was back out. I hadn't heard anything. Nobody else was downstairs. This time, I felt genuinely unsettled. The drawer hadn't simply slid out. It had been jammed into place. I left it where it was and decided it was the property manager's problem. When I checked on Jen, she was still upstairs cleaning, so I returned to my own work. Eventually, I started reinstalling the clean light fixtures. Since it was a bright summer afternoon, I turned the lights off while I worked. I was standing on a small ladder trying to secure one of the fixtures when the lights suddenly switched on. The sudden brightness startled me, and I fell backward on the ladder. A second later, the fixture slipped from my hands and came crashing down. It narrowly missed hitting me in the head. For a few seconds, I just sat there on the floor. I could see the light switch from where I had fallen. Nobody was near it. At the same time, I could clearly hear Jen moving around upstairs. Only a few seconds had passed. There was no possible way she could have run downstairs, turned on the light, and gotten back upstairs. The switch had somehow turned on by itself. At least that's what it looked like. I still wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I was just uncomfortable. At that point, I decided I was done working alone and went upstairs to find Jen. When I told her what happened, she looked uneasy. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. A few minutes earlier, she thought she'd heard someone call her name too. It didn't sound like me. We were both officially creeped out. The only task left was sweeping the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down there alone, so we went together. The basement was exactly as I described earlier. One large open concrete room with nowhere to hide. While Jen swept, I sat on the dryer and talked with her. A few minutes later, we finished and headed back upstairs. We were relieved to be almost done. We started gathering our supplies in the living room. I was standing maybe 2 feet from the open basement door when it happened. From below us came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Both of us froze. The footsteps were loud enough that neither of us questioned what we were hearing. Then came something far worse. The footsteps suddenly broke into a run. They were charging up the stairs, fast and loud, coming directly toward us. The footsteps got louder. I looked at Jen, and her face had gone completely white. Neither of us said a word. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the basement door and slammed it shut as hard as I could. Then Jen and I ran. We flew out the front door and across the lawn. At one point, I heard Jen yell behind me, "The key!" I yelled back, "Leave it!" Neither of us stopped until we were on the other side of the complex. I barely remember what happened afterward. Eventually, we returned to the property manager and told her someone had been inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and never went back. As far as I know, she contacted the police before anyone entered the condo. We never told her what we had actually experienced. What could we say? That something invisible had spent the entire afternoon calling our names? Moving objects around? Turning lights on and finally charging up the basement stairs? It sounded ridiculous. Even now, I'm not someone who believes every strange story is paranormal. I've had other experiences in my life that could probably be explained one way or another. This one is different though. Maybe we imagined hearing our names. Maybe there was some mechanical explanation for the oven drawer. Maybe the light switch malfunctioned. But that basement was empty. There was nowhere for anybody to hide. And those footsteps weren't distant or ambiguous. They sounded exactly like someone running up a staircase directly toward us. Even now, more than 20 years later, hearing someone run up a set of stairs sends me right back to that summer afternoon. I'm still a skeptic, but I never have been able to explain what happened in that condo. When I was younger, I was a hustler and a go-getter, always looking for the next way to make a quick buck, and my mom knew an older couple from a church group who needed help around their property for a couple of weeks. Their names were Richard and Elaine, and they were both in their late 60s, old but not super old. They lived in a pretty rural area about 40 minutes away from my house. They were in one of those older farmhouses with a long gravel driveway and woods behind the property. The deal was simple. But I would stay there for a little over a week, help Richard with yard work, cleaning out the garage, moving furniture, painting a fence, things like that, and they would pay me at the end. My mom trusted them because she knew Richard from years back, and Elaine seemed really sweet the first time I met her. She was quiet, but she smiled a lot and kept asking if I was hungry. The house itself was fine. It was what you'd expect an elderly couple to live in a quiet area. Upstairs at the end of the hall was the room I'd be sleeping. On my first day there, Richard showed me around the property and then gave me a verbal list of things we'd work on, and Elaine made dinner. I noticed early on that Elaine didn't talk much, but she always had a neutral to half smile on her face. She asked my name 3 different times, to which Richard just said she forgets things sometimes. I figured he meant normal old person forgetfulness, so I didn't think much of it. That night, I went upstairs around 11 and tried to sleep. Sometime around probably 3 in the morning, I woke up and heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking back and forth outside my room. I knew it. The floorboards creaked every few seconds. Maybe Richard was going to the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't go anywhere. They just passed my door, went down the hall, turned around, and came back. I laid there in the dark listening to it for maybe 10 minutes, and it got increasingly uncomfortable until they seemed to stop right outside the door. I stared at the big, dark gap under the door, and I felt like I could see the outline of 2 feet. After a while, the footsteps moved away again, which confirmed that what I was seeing was in fact 2 outlines of feet. The next morning, I mentioned it to Richard while we were outside working. He didn't look surprised. He just said Elaine sometimes wandered at night because she had bad dreams and got confused, and that I shouldn't worry about it. When I asked if I should lock my door at night, he kind of laughed and said the guest room didn't have a lock because the house was old, so I let it go. But the second night was worse. I woke up again to the same footstep sounds, except this time they were faster. I could hear Elaine muttering to herself in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard my name once, which gave me goosebumps. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times. I was starting to hate that large gap under the door. The doorknob twisted, stopped, and the door opened about an inch. It stayed open a crack for just a moment, and I heard a whispering voice through the crack, but I couldn't make out what was said. Then the door shut again. After that, I had trouble sleeping, like I think anyone would in my shoes. In the morning, I told Richard exactly what happened. Once again, he explained it away. His explanation was she probably thought the room was empty, and that she had been doing things like that more lately. He said it was embarrassing for her and asked me not to bring it up around Elaine. During the day, she seemed mostly normal, doing things like making lunch, folding towels, and watering plants, which made the whole thing harder to process. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room with this flat, suspicious look. It was like she didn't recognize me, but also didn't like that I was there. On the 4th day, Richard and I were cleaning out a shed behind the house. I noticed a dented metal walker shoved behind some boxes, and next to it was a broken picture frame with dried brown stains on the glass. This is kind of important for later. Later on that same day, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long scratch on the hallway wall, about chest height, like something had been dragged across it. There were also small holes in one of the doors downstairs, like someone had hit it with something. These all seemed like signs of struggle. That night, I put my suitcase in front of my bedroom door. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone, but I figured it would at least make noise if the door opened. Around 2:30, I woke up to the sound of the suitcase scraping across the floor. I looked and saw my bedroom door was halfway open. Elaine was standing in the doorway in her nightgown. I saw her mouth hung open as she was heavily mouth-breathing. I said her name, trying not to sound scared, even though the sight was horrifying. When she stepped into the room, that was when I saw she was holding a kitchen knife at her side. She walked closer to the bed and started whispering something, which I quickly was able to understand as, "You don't belong here." She said it like 5 times. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." She came all the way to the side of the bed and stood over me with the knife hanging in her hand. I yelled for Richard as loud as I could. Elaine flinched like the sound scared her, then she turned and marched out of the room. Even the stiff way she marched out of the room was terrifying. She slammed the door and marched away. Richard came upstairs maybe 30 seconds later, acting annoyed, like I had woken him up for no reason. I told him she had been in my room with a knife. He kept saying she wouldn't hurt anyone and that she wasn't herself at night. This was officially when him downplaying her behavior began to piss me off. I said I wanted to go home, and he replied it was 3 in the morning and my mom was probably asleep. He said we'll talk about it in the morning. I should have called my mom right there, but I didn't want to make the situation bigger. I pushed the dresser in front of the door after he left and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, Elaine acted like nothing happened. She made pancakes and was smiling again, giving normal grandmother vibes. Richard pulled me aside and apologized, but it didn't feel like a real apology. He said Elaine's memory had been getting worse, which sounded like an understatement. When I asked him if she had ever attacked anyone before, he took a pause, then he said she had gotten upset with a caregiver once, but that it was handled. That was the first time I realized he had definitely been hiding things from me. I told him a second time that I wanted to leave. He said he understood, but my mom was at work until late and he would drive me home the next morning after we finished one last job and they paid me. That afternoon, while Richard was outside on the phone, I went looking for my backpack because I wanted to pack early. For some reason, I found it in the laundry room. On my backpack, there was a blood stain clear as day, right on the outer pocket. I called Richard into the room and showed him the blood. He grabbed the backpack, looking a little more angry than I'd seen yet, and he told me he accidentally cut himself earlier and moved my backpack in there while he cleaned up the blood. He finished it off with a "stop worrying." I told him I was calling my mom, and he once again tried to get me to calm down. I went upstairs, packed my bag, and tried calling anyway. The call failed twice, so I texted her to come get me, but it didn't send. Richard also refused to give me the Wi-Fi password. That was when I really started to feel trapped. I had to tank through until she came the next morning. The final night, I didn't even get in bed. I sat fully dressed on the top of the blanket with my shoes on and my bag next to me. I moved the dresser in front of the door again, but around midnight, Richard came upstairs and told me to move it because it was dangerous in case of a fire. I refused at first, and for the first time, I heard him yell. He told me to move the dresser now. I complied and moved it just enough so the door could open. After he left, I waited in the dark with my phone in hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elaine downstairs. She was yelling this time. It sounded like she was yelling at Richard. Then I heard glass break. Richard said her name, trying to calm her down, and then there was a loud thud, followed by him shouting in pain. It sounded like she just attacked him. I got up and cracked my door open. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from the staircase from downstairs. Footsteps started coming up the stairs fast. I shut my door and pushed the dresser back as hard as I could. A few seconds later, Elaine hit the door from the other side. The doorknob rattled violently, and she started saying again and again that I didn't belong here. She sounded furious. The door shook as she hit it again and again, and I heard something metal strike the wood, and a piece of the door splintered inward. My sights landed on the window, my only exit, and I decided I was jumping out. I could hear Richard downstairs groaning and calling for her. Whatever she did to him, she was about to do to me, maybe worse. I got the window up and kicked out the screen. There was a small roof over the porch below the window, so I climbed out onto it with my backpack. Elaine was still banging on the door when I jumped out. I dropped from the porch roof into the bushes below. I ran down the gravel driveway without looking back. I could hear the front door open behind me, and Elaine was yelling from the porch. She was holding what I could only guess was a fireplace poker in one hand. I kept running until I reached the road, where I finally was able to call 911 with service. The police and an ambulance showed up maybe 15 minutes later. Richard had a cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to stop her. Elaine was taken away by paramedics. The police got a hold of my mom, and she arrived as soon as she could. Richard later told my mom that Elaine had been getting worse for months, but he didn't want to put her in a facility because he felt guilty. He thought on the evening of December 24th, 2001, 48-year-old Kevin Butler was at his home in the Pleasant Grove neighborhood of southeast Dallas getting ready to head out for Christmas Eve dinner with his best friend Michael DiNardo. What Kevin didn't know was that two men had spent most of that afternoon drinking in their front yard a block behind his house and were planning to come over that night for reasons that had nothing to do with Christmas. Butler lived alone in his house and ran a local swimming pool company out of the area. According to his sister Kathy, he took in stray cats and dogs and treated them with love. The one he was closest to was an 18-inch white-crested cockatoo Kevin had taken in 2 years earlier from a roommate who'd have to move and couldn't bring him along. Kevin named him Bird. From people who knew their relationship, they knew one thing about Bird. He didn't take kindly to strangers. Back at the restaurant, after waiting for an hour, Michael DiNardo started to worry about his friend. Kevin wasn't picking up the phone, and that wasn't like him. After several calls went to voicemail, Michael decided to drive to his house to check up on him, but when he pulled up into the driveway, it was clear something was wrong. The front door of the house was wide open, and even though it was late at night, the lights inside the house were still on. Looking around, Michael also noticed that Kevin's pickup truck, the one he used to park in the driveway, was gone. Fearing something terrible had happened to his friend, Michael called 911. When officers from the Dallas Police Department arrived, they found the house ransacked. Items were scattered across the floor, drawers were pulled out, and furniture was overturned. Everything in that house felt like a fight had taken place. That feeling would be confirmed the moment they entered the living room. Kevin Butler lay in the middle of the floor with his arms and legs bound with electrical cord. His shirt was soaked through with blood as multiple stab wounds marked his chest and abdomen. There were bruises across his upper body from a beating, and his throat had been slashed. Whoever had done this hadn't been in a hurry. They had taken their time. But what the officers found next was even more bizarre. Looking through the rest of the house, officers walked into the kitchen where they found Bird lying on the floor near the back wall. He was missing a leg, his wings were broken, and there was a small pool of blood underneath him. A later forensic examination would confirm that he had been killed by a stab wound to the back. But there was one thing about the scene that caught the officers' attention even in all of this. The cockatoo's beak and claws were covered in blood. Police took both bodies to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office and examined the rest of the house. In the living room, on a light switch a few feet from where the attack had taken place, they found another smear of blood. The same kind of blood was on the handles of 2 of the 4 knives recovered from the scene, but after forensic testing, it would later come to light that none of the blood at the scene had come from Kevin or Bird. Whoever had walked into Kevin's house that night had walked out of it bleeding. By now, police had DNA from 4 separate locations inside the house, but they had no name to match it to yet. The lead investigator, Detective Brent Malden, began working through Butler's coworkers, neighbors, and anyone who had a reason to have been around that house, and it didn't take long for a name to surface. Several people Butler worked with told police about a former employee he'd recently fired and had a public falling out with. That employee was 22-year-old Johnny Cerna, and he lived a block behind Butler's house with his 30-year-old half-brother Daniel Torres. Cerna had worked for Butler's pool company for some time. The exact length isn't on the public record, but it was long enough that Butler had come to trust him with company money. One day he was given a payment to cover an above-ground pool liner, but somewhere between Butler writing it out and the bank processing it, Cerna altered the check. When Butler found out, he fired Cerna on the spot, and in just a few months, what had started as a workplace dispute had turned into something else entirely. Malden brought them in for questioning a few days into the investigation. Both denied being anywhere near Butler's house that night. For now, he had nothing to hold them on. But before sending them home, Malden took their cheek swabs. If they'd bled inside Butler's house, the lab would confirm it. On paper, Cerna was the obvious lead. He was a fired employee with a fresh grudge against Butler, living less than 100 yards from the house where Butler had been killed. So all that was left now was to wait for the DNA results to put Cerna into that house. But this would prove to be more difficult. DNA testing in 2002 was still relatively new in everyday casework, and the Dallas County Crime Lab was running months behind on its caseload. When the results finally came back in July of 2002, it had been 7 months, and they weren't what Malden had expected. The blood on the light switch, the 2 knife handles, Bird's beak, and the fingerprints lifted from inside the house, none of it belonged to Cerna. All of it traced back to his 30-year-old half-brother, Daniel Torres. Faced with the DNA evidence, Torres still denied being anywhere near Butler's house that night. He waived his Miranda rights and signed a written statement saying he had no idea how his blood had gotten inside, but Malden didn't believe his story. A few days later, Torres signed a second statement, this time admitting he had been inside Butler's house on Christmas Eve, but he hadn't touched him. In his version of events, he and Cerna had been drinking in their front yard when Butler drove by and flipped them off. Cerna had said he wanted Butler to pay. Sometime later, Torres noticed Cerna had left, so he walked over to Butler's house to check on his half-brother. By the time he got there, Cerna already had Butler on the floor and was stomping on him with a knife. Torres claimed he tried to wrestle the knife away and cut his hand doing it, so he panicked, grabbed Butler's truck keys, and took off. According to him, Butler was tied up on the floor and still alive when he left. He also said that during the struggle, the bird had come at him off the porch and pecked at him, in his own words, all over my head, and that he'd grabbed a fork and stabbed at it to make it stop. It explained everything in the kitchen, the injuries the bird suffered, and the trail of feathers running across the house. Confronted with his half-brother's evidence, Cerna eventually broke as well. He told Malden that Daniel had been the one to slash Kevin's throat, while he had searched the rest of the house for valuables. Between the two of them, they walked out with around $1,200. Both were charged with capital murder. In February of 2003, Daniel Torres stood trial in the 292nd Judicial District Court of Dallas County in front of Judge Henry M. Wade Jr. The state's case rested on the DNA found from the different locations in the house. Torres was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Johnny Cerna was tried later that same year and given the same sentence. In his closing argument at Daniel Torres' trial, prosecutor George West had told the jury that Kevin's family had already known. Quote, "This bird spoke. He spoke to us. We know this bird will attack anybody who's attacking his owner. And who did he attack? Daniel Torres." Bird had given his life defending his owner and friend that night. Before he died, he'd left the mark that would eventually put his killer in handcuffs. In September of 2018, the quiet streets of South Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania became the scene of one of the most brutal murders in the city's recent history. But the first sign that something was wrong wasn't a 911 call or a frantic witness. It was a single panicked golden retriever running loose on Cary Avenue at 3 in the morning with nobody chasing him and nowhere left to go. Shortly after, residents in the area began calling in reports of a stray golden retriever wandering the streets. Police Sergeant Joseph Ziegler was dispatched to the location and found the animal unharmed at the nearby Turkey Hill mini-mart that he'd wandered into. The officer was in luck. The dog was wearing a collar, which helped identify its name, Joe. The collar also carried his owner's phone number and address. Figuring this would be a simple find and return case, Officer Ziegler called the owner, but nobody picked up. The same silence would follow after the second and third call. When none of his calls got through, the officer had no choice but to drive the dog to his 14 Donald Court address, roughly half a mile from the store. It was nearing 4 a.m., and the owner was likely asleep. But when the officer reached the address, something clearly wasn't right. The door to the house was unlocked, and the lights were on inside. Maybe the owner had gone out looking for the dog after Joe got out and lost his way. So Ziegler tried the doorbell a few times, hoping somebody would eventually come around to the front door. But nobody responded. That's when he realized this was no longer a routine call and asked for backup. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood became unrecognizable. Flashing police cruisers lined the street with yellow tape stretched across the lawn. Once the officers got inside the house, it was clear something terrible had happened. The first floor was a complete mess. There was blood everywhere, The kitchen floor was littered with items, and the patio and garage doors were wide open, but it wasn't until they got to the second floor that the cops realized what they were dealing with. As they approached the master bedroom, they saw a man face down on the floor near the nightstand. His shirt was soaked with blood. The sight alone was bad enough, but the smell was worse. The gash in his lower back, along with the 8.5-inch knife lying just feet away, made it clear how he'd died. Everything in the room was either scattered or overturned, which told the police he hadn't gone down without a fight. But while searching, officers found something far more chilling: a red gas can sitting near the victim's body. The man was identified as 58-year-old Fred Boot. The patrolman who found him, James Fisher, had known him personally for years. Boot was a well-loved member of the Wilkes-Barre community and a father to 4 grown children. His wife Erin had passed away 3 years earlier in 2015, but rather than let her memory fade with time, Fred kept it alive by setting up a scholarship in her name. His obituary would read how welcoming he was and how much he loved his dogs, Mia and Joe. In the end, it was Joe who led the cops to that house. Now it was up to them to bring Fred's killer to justice. Their first lead came from Brian, Fred's son. Brian had been trying to reach his father, but like Officer Ziegler, he'd called him repeatedly until the silence became impossible to ignore. That's when he pinged his father's phone and discovered it wasn't at Donald Court. It was a few blocks away on Willow Street. The phone was one of only 2 things taken from Fred's house that night. The other was a $20 bill. Neither of them gave investigators much to work with, but all of that would change in the next 12 hours. At roughly 1 p.m., locals reported a fire in the basement of a nearby apartment building on Maffett Street. When firefighters arrived, they found a pile of clothing and shoes burning in the shared basement of the building with a layer of tar paper draped over the top. The fire had been set deliberately. Believing it might be connected to the murder from earlier that morning, they contacted the police. The pattern on the soles of the shoes was an exact match for the bloody footprints leading away from Fred Boot's bedroom. Whoever had tried to burn Fred's lifeless body the night before had later gone to 95 Maffett Street to destroy any evidence of their presence. This was the killer's second attempt to erase himself from the evidence, but it would fail spectacularly. Earlier, before the fire was reported, a surveillance camera had recorded a man walking into Geisinger's South Wilkes-Barre Hospital. His hands were badly torn up and bleeding, the kind of wounds you'd get from losing your grip on a knife mid-swing. He told the hospital staff he'd been assaulted the previous night, and they had no real reason to question him, but the cops eventually would. That same day, a woman named Carmen Carty walked into a police station and reported her 14-year-old daughter, Louisa Reyes, missing. According to Carmen, Louisa had left the night before with her boyfriend and was potentially in danger. That boyfriend was the same man captured on the hospital surveillance camera that morning, with his hands wrapped in bloody bandages. In the span of less than 24 hours, police were now juggling 4 separate incidents: a murder, an arson, a hospital walk-in with knife injuries, and a missing teenage girl. And all 4 led back to the same man, 31-year-old Reynaldo Mercado. He lived in the building at 95 Maffett Street, only a few blocks from Willow Street, where Fred's phone was located. The same building where the basement fire had been set hours earlier. Mercado was staying there with Louisa, the 14-year-old daughter of Fred's ex-girlfriend. She had once lived at Fred's house herself with her mother Carmen until Fred ended the relationship that summer. But by the time police had pieced this together, Mercado was already across state lines planning to flee the country to the Dominican Republic. He would have been successful if it wasn't for one mistake Mercado had told his uncle. He and Reyes had shown up at his uncle's house in West New York the night before. The plan was simple: get into New York City in the morning, get a passport, and fly out. Jose didn't believe him at first, so Mercado pulled up the local news reports from Wilkes-Barre and showed his uncle the headlines about Fred Boot. Jose Mercado had just listened to his nephew confess to killing a man in Pennsylvania, and like any responsible citizen, he told the police everything. Mercado was arrested in West New York the next day and was extradited back to Wilkes-Barre that same week. 2 years later, a Luzerne County jury convicted him on every count: first-degree murder, arson, robbery, and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison. Louisa Reyes was tried as an adult despite being 14. She took a plea deal and was given 40 years. After the verdict, the Boot family released a short, heartfelt statement Fred would have been proud of. As for Joe, the dog who set the entire investigation into motion, he went home with Brian, Fred's son. The scholarship Fred had set up in Erin's name now also carries his. the Fred and Erin Boot Scholarship for the Arts. On the morning of December 30th, 2018, a police officer from the Virreyes Oeste police station stood guard outside a crime scene in the Presidente Perón neighborhood of San Bernardo, Argentina. What he didn't know was that someone else was still in the victim's house. While waiting for the forensics team, he heard a woman scream from inside, which was strange because the only person in there was already dead. When he went to check, nothing had changed. The body was right where he'd left it. Then the scream came again, and this time he traced it to a green parrot in a cage by the wall, shrieking the same words at full volume. "Oh, please let me go. Oh no." And at first, no one took it seriously. It was too strange to be a clue, and too senseless to mean anything. The reason the officer was there in the first place was around 6 a.m., a man named Miguel Santorino Roland called 911. Roland, who went by Mambo, told officers he'd come home from his overnight shift at the Virreyes Rugby Club, about 100 meters away, and found a woman dead in her room. When officers arrived at the house, they found the wooden loft in complete disarray. There were mattresses on the floor, items scattered around the room, and in the middle of it was the body of a woman lying face up, without clothes and with bruises across her face and body, suggesting brutal physical violence. As officers walked through the scene, Roland wrapped both hands around his own throat and suggested that she had probably been strangled. This was strange considering the forensic team hadn't arrived yet, and nobody in that house should have known how she died. The woman was 46-year-old Elizabeth Alejandra Toledo. Known to the people around her as Ellie, she had a moderate intellectual disability and rented the wooden loft at the top of House 27, at the corner of Boedo and Garidi Streets in the Presidente Perón neighborhood. The parrot in the cage was hers. Ellie had raised it in her care and called it Patchouli. Over time, the two of them had grown close enough that the bird had learned the sounds and phrases of her daily life. Apart from her pet, she shared the house with 3 men. Roland was described as her partner. The second man was 64-year-old George Alvarez, known as Tio George. The third had been kicked out by the landlord 2 weeks earlier, specifically because the landlord had caught him physically abusing Ellie. According to people in her life, the abuse had been going on for some time. None of it had ever been reported. Within days, prosecutor Viviana Santella from the Gender Violence Unit of San Fernando had all 3 men brought in for questioning. The third was cleared almost immediately when the landlord confirmed he'd been expelled from the property roughly 15 days before the murder, which gave him a verified alibi. That left Roland and Alvarez, who were arrested in January 2019 and held in pre-trial detention, neither of whom agreed to testify. In the meantime, the autopsy was performed by Dr. Federico Corasaniti, and it confirms that Ellie had been sexually assaulted during the attack, hit multiple times, and then manually strangled, which eventually took her life. All of these injuries had been inflicted while she was still alive. As a result, after nearly 3 years of pretrial detention, Roland walked out a free man. But during the trial, the prosecution also brought forward evidence that went beyond the question of who killed Ellie, and spoke to what her life had been like before the night she died. One of those details came from the police officer who had been stationed at the loft on December 30th. He told the court about the scream he heard coming from inside the room, and the words he eventually traced back to Patchouli's cage. "Oh, please let me go. Oh no." These words were formally entered into the case file as evidence, and they were not the only words Patchouli had learned. A neighbor who ran a small shop down the street and used to sell Ellie birdseed for the parrot also appeared in the case file and said she had once heard the parrot repeat a different phrase, "Why did you hit me?" And she remembered exactly when she heard it. It was right around the time the third man had been kicked out of the house for hitting Ellie. Once you give this detail enough attention, it changes how you see everything else in this case, because for a parrot to commit a particular sentence to memory, it usually needs to hear that phrase repeated many times for the sound to register. "Please let me go," or "Why did you hit me?" isn't something a parrot learns from a single night. So for Patchouli to say those words, Elizabeth would have had to say them over and over across multiple weeks in the same desperate tone every time. This means what the officer heard that morning wasn't a recording of her final moments. It was a recording of her everyday life.
A parrot can repeat up to 150 words, depending on the species. But specifically, you have to repeat many times for a parrot to say something like that, "No, please let me go." It's quite complex what the parrot learned. Imagine what this woman must have suffered before these 2 men ended up murdering her.
As for Alvarez, the evidence against him was much more direct. During the autopsy, the organic remains collected from the victim's body matched his genetic profile. On top of that, an eyewitness also placed him entering and leaving the house around the time of the attack. To make it even more disturbing, roughly 10 days after the murder, an acquaintance walked into the prosecutor's office and reported that Alvarez had confessed to him that he had gone to the house, had sexual intercourse with Elizabeth, and only afterward realized she had already passed. But the forensic evidence proved otherwise and confirmed that the injuries were consistent with sexual assault inflicted while Ellie was still alive. The court convicted him of aggravated sexual assault and femicide and sentenced him to life in prison. As for Petrulli, he was taken in by one of Ellie's sisters after the trial. It's not been reported whether it ever repeated those words again, but for however long it lived, it carried the only recording that existed of what Ellie's life sounded like inside that loft. In the fall of 1994, a woman's car was found abandoned in a field on Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province. The island's a popular holiday destination in summer, but in winter it became cold, quiet, and buried under heavy snow. With a population of roughly 100,000 at the time, it was a close-knit community where pretty much everyone knew each other. But this abandoned car would set off one of the most horrifying murder investigations on the island, and eventually push investigators into territory no murder case had gone before. It belonged to 32-year-old Shirley Duguay. Shirley was a mother of 5. She stood 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. Because of her height, she kept a pillow in the driver's seat of her car so she could see over the steering wheel comfortably. On October 3rd, 1994, Shirley left her children in the care of her father, Melvin, and went out to run a few errands, only to never return home.
We found it very odd that no one had reported her missing initially, and of course it raised some suspicion with us.
Shirley Duguay had been known in the past to take off for a couple of days and not tell anyone where she had gone and then return.
When she didn't come back after several hours, Melvin didn't report her missing right away, as it wasn't unusual for Shirley to take off for a few days without telling anyone. But this time, the previously harmless pattern proved to be fatal. What her family didn't know yet was that the man she'd spent years trying to get away from had already made sure she wouldn't be coming back. 4 days later, a local woman called police about an abandoned car in a field near Highway 169. The license plates had been removed, and inside, investigators found blood spatter on the windshield and across the interior, the kind of pattern caused by someone being struck repeatedly. The pillow Shirley used while driving was also found close to the car, soaked in blood. For the police, it was the first clear sign that Shirley hadn't simply taken off for a few days, and when they tested it against a sample from Melvin, it confirmed what they were afraid of. The blood carried half of his genetic markers, meaning it belonged to Shirley. But there was no body to be found anywhere nearby, and on Prince Edward Island, where people were not used to violent crimes like this, the case quickly became one of the largest searches the province had ever seen. RCMP officers, 120 military personnel from CFB Gagetown, students from the Atlantic Police Academy, and local residents searched across hundreds of square miles and waterways for months. The first useful item they found was a shovel about a half-mile from the car. Attached to it were 2 long black hairs. When compared with hair from Shirley's hairbrush, the hairs were microscopically similar, enough to make investigators believe the shovel had likely been used after the attack. And weeks later, roughly 15 miles away, inside a plastic bag, they found a pair of white size 9 sneakers and a man's brown leather jacket, also stained with Shirley's blood. The jacket was far too large for Shirley, but when investigators examined the lining, they found something unusual. Roughly 20 brittle white hairs pressed into the fabric. Under a microscope, the center of each hair was much thicker than investigators would expect from human hair. Investigators suspected these hairs to be cat hairs, which was a major roadblock, because no one had ever used animal DNA in a criminal investigation before, and this meant that there was no forensic framework to interpret it. However, by now, the police already had their main suspect. Shirley had been in a relationship with a man named Douglas Beamish for roughly 15 years, and these 15 years were traumatic for Shirley, to say the least. Douglas was a demolition worker with a documented history of domestically abusing her during this period. In 1991, a peace bond, Canada's version of a restraining order, had been issued against him. When Shirley finally left and moved back to Prince Edward Island with the kids, hoping the smallest province in the country would be far enough to put distance between her and Douglas, he followed her there. By the time Shirley disappeared, he was living with his parents just a short drive away. In cases like this, an abusive former partner would naturally be one of the first people the police looked at. But in this case, Douglas's history with Shirley wasn't the only reason for them to be suspicious of him. In the summer of 1992, during one of their earlier separations, he had written her a letter threatening to kill her before he'd allow her to get custody of their children. But when the investigators visited his parents' house to question Douglas, he denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Shirley for almost a week before she disappeared, and said their last conversation had been pleasant. He also denied owning the brown leather jacket, and even though the sneakers found in the bag were size 9, the same size he wore, he insisted they weren't his. At that point, investigators had no direct way to prove otherwise. But during that visit, Constable Roger Savoy noticed something that stayed with him. Douglas's parents had a pure white cat named Snowball, and at some point during the interview, the cat rubbed against Savoy's leg, leaving fine white hairs on his trousers. They looked almost identical to the brittle white hairs found inside the blood-stained jacket, so if those hairs had really come from Snowball, then the jacket Douglas denied owning could be linked to the household where he was living, but proving that was another problem entirely.
If we could prove that it was this particular cat's hair, then we would be able to say, well, this belonged to Mr. Beamish, the jacket. And the job was to find someone that could do this type of testing.
Savoy began calling DNA labs across Canada and the United States, asking if anyone could test cat hair and match it back to a specific cat. Eventually, the investigators found Dr. Stephen O'Brien at the National Cancer Institute in Maryland, a geneticist who'd spent decades studying hereditary illness in cats. O'Brien's team adapted feline DNA profiling for the case, using genetic markers to compare the hair from the jacket with Snowball's blood. It was a technique that had never been attempted in a criminal investigation before. But even then, the evidence almost disappeared before it could matter. Of the roughly 20 cat hairs recovered from the jacket lining, only one had a root with enough DNA to test, which meant the entire theory came down to a single hair. The DNA from that root matched Snowball's blood at every marker tested. Now that sounds like the end of the question, but later during the trial, it could very likely open a new one. Prince Edward Island is geographically isolated, so if the island's cat population was heavily inbred, it was possible that many cats could share a similar genetic profile. In that case, the match would be completely meaningless. To address that, O'Brien's team tested blood from 20 random cats across the island.
You need to know that some other cat on Prince Edward Island couldn't have contributed that hair. What if 25% of the cats on Prince Edward Island had the same DNA profile, or 10%, or even 1 in 100 cats?
The results showed that the probability that the hair came from any cat other than Snowball was roughly 1 in 45 million. But even with this tying the jacket to Douglas with almost certainty, in order to arrest him, the police needed a crime. They still had no evidence that could tell them where Shirley was or prove what exactly happened to her after she disappeared. That changed several months later, when a trout fisherman walking along the Enmore River noticed a pile of brush on the riverbank that didn't look natural. Underneath it was a shallow hole only a few feet wide and unusually short for a regular grave. But for someone who stood only 4 feet 9 inches tall, it was enough. Inside, investigators found Shirley Duguay. The condition of her remains confirmed that the blood in the car had only been the beginning of the attack. Her nose had been broken, her jaw had been fractured in 3 places, and one of her front teeth had been knocked out with enough force that it was later found embedded in her lung. Her hands had also been tied behind her back, and from the injuries, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had died from blunt force trauma and strangulation. With that, the missing person case became a murder case. Douglas Beamish was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the cat's DNA was presented alongside the human blood evidence. On September 19, 1996, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 18 years. It became the first murder conviction in the world based on animal DNA. I was 21 when this happened. It was 2017, and at the time, I was working part-time at a gas station a few towns over from where I lived. It was one of those jobs I only planned to keep for a few months, just until I figured out what I wanted to do next. The shifts were usually easy, a lot of ringing up snacks and cigarettes and stuff like that, more so than the occasional person paying for gas and cash.
During the day, it was annoying but normal. The nights were different. The nights dragged. The place felt too bright inside and too dark outside, and every customer felt a little stranger. That night, I was working the closing shift by myself, and I still think about it all the time. The store closed at midnight. Around 9 or 10 at night, the phone started ringing. I answered without thinking anything of it. The second I picked up, I heard this weird voice. It was low and drawn out, like someone trying to sound like a killer in a horror movie. It reminded me right away of Ghostface from Scream. It sounded really forced, like someone trying to do an impression, but yet it was still unsettling. The voice asked if I was all alone in the store. I just stayed quiet for a second, then said something sarcastic like, "Yeah, you got me," and then I hung up. I figured it was one of my friends messing with me. I texted the group chat and asked which one of them was calling the store pretending to be a serial killer. They all found it funny and acted confused at first. One of them asked what I was talking about, then another said he was at home. I assumed they were just lying because that would have been the obvious response if they wanted to keep the prank going. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was that same fake horror movie voice. This time they asked why I hung up. I once again sarcastically said, "All right, you got me." The voice let out this soft laugh that sounded weirdly real, not playful like I expected. Then it said I shouldn't be rude to people who know where I am. I hung up again, but this time I felt a little off. It was probably still a joke, but there was something about how calm the person sounded that got me. I kept trying to shake it off. Customers were still coming in at that point, enough to keep me distracted. People getting gas, buying beer, and getting lottery tickets. But every time it slowed down, I found myself looking at the phone. It rang a third time around 10:40. I answered, and I immediately regretted it. The voice asked if the store always got this quiet that late. That got under my skin more than I want to admit. I said nothing and hung up. After that, I texted my friends again, this time more seriously. I said it was getting old and asked who was doing it. Again, they all denied it. I started messaging them one by one. It was the same thing. One was with his girlfriend, one sent me a picture from his basement, one was apparently at a friend's house almost half an hour away. At that point, I started getting annoyed instead of scared. I thought maybe they had someone else doing it, but the truth was, even though the caller never said my name, he was saying things that matched what was happening in the store, like how quiet it was. Around 11, the calls started coming closer together. I stopped answering after the fifth one. The phone would ring and I would stare at it and let it stop on its own. Then a minute or two later, it would ring again. That went on for maybe 15 minutes. I started checking the cameras more. There were a few around the outside of the building and a few inside. The store sat by itself off a road that got pretty dead at night. There was a small patch of woods behind one side of the building and an alley-like area where the dumpster was. The outside cameras weren't great. They had blind spots and the picture at night was grainy. Still, I kept flipping through them, half expecting to catch one of my idiot friends crouched outside laughing. I didn't see anyone though. Then I started hearing little sounds outside, which at first I told myself was nothing. For example, a tap somewhere. Then what sounded like a light scrape near the sidewall. Then a noise by the back that sounded like someone stepping on loose gravel. It got to a point where I couldn't dismiss it any longer. I texted the group chat again and told them to seriously stop. I even sent a picture of the empty store and wrote that this wasn't funny anymore. They kept denying it. One of my friends actually called me from his normal number and I told him what was happening. He sounded genuinely confused and said he wasn't joking, nor was he involved in any joke. He told me to lock the door early if I had to. I didn't want to do that unless I really felt I needed to. Part of me still thought I was making too much of it. At around 11:40, one last customer came in. I remember the exact sound of the door opening because it made me jump. I looked up and saw just a regular-looking guy at first, maybe late 20s or 30s. Nothing outwardly crazy about him. He wasn't dirty or dressed weird. He just had this blank expression. He didn't say hello, he just walked in and started moving through the aisles. I watched him on the cameras while pretending not to. He took way too long for someone who ended up buying one bag of chips. He kept drifting to different aisles and then stopping. More than once, I saw the top half of his face appear above the shelves while he looked toward the counter. Not in a casual way either. It felt like he was checking on me. I kept thinking maybe he was high or maybe he was tired, or maybe he was deciding what he wanted. But my stomach had that heavy feeling by then, like my body already knew something was wrong before my brain wanted to admit it. He was in there for at least 8 or 9 minutes. Then he finally came up to the counter with a bag of chips. He still didn't say a word, so I didn't either. I just took the chips and scanned them. When I looked down at the register, everything felt normal for 1 second. Then I looked up and caught him staring directly into my eyes. He held it for maybe 2 seconds. It doesn't sound long, but it was. There was no expression on his face when he did it. Then he looked down and paid. I handed him back the bag, and he turned and walked toward the door. I remember thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a weird guy. But right as he got to the door and pushed it halfway open, he stopped and turned his head back toward me without fully turning his body. His chin was slightly lowered, so his eyes had to look up at me. Then he smiled. I still don't know how to explain that smile without sounding dramatic. It looked like he knew exactly how creepy he looked, and he was doing it on purpose. It made every hair on my body stand up. Then he stepped outside, and instead of walking toward any of the pumps or toward a car, he walked around the side of the building. When he did it, he kept his eyes on me through the glass. He kept that smile, too. I just stood there watching him until the angle cut him off. Then I rushed to the camera monitor and followed him there. I saw him round the building and head toward the side where the woods were. Then he disappeared into the blind spot behind the building. He didn't come back out. I waited maybe 10 seconds, then 20, then a minute. He never reappeared. That was enough for me to lock the door early, even though it was a little before midnight. This part might sound dramatic, but I texted my family and my friends and told them that there was a creepy guy outside and I wasn't joking anymore. I said if I stopped replying, that meant something probably happened to me because of him. I rushed through the closing stuff as fast as I could. I barely cleaned anything. I kept checking the cameras over and over, expecting to see him pop back out. Nothing. Midnight hit, and I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my stuff, turned off what I needed to turn off, and went to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped out, and that moment of having to relock it was so tense I couldn't have done it quick enough. Once I did, I took off running to my car. It was parked off to the side of the building. I got most of the way there, and just as I reached it and slowed for half a second, I heard fast footsteps. Not running, but worse somehow, like speed-walking steps slapping the pavement in front of the store. I turned and saw him. It was that guy. He had come from the front corner of the building and was moving toward me and my car fast. I yanked my car door open and threw myself inside. I locked the door and started the engine so fast I almost flooded it. The second the car started, I hit reverse and peeled out of that lot. I looked once in the mirror and saw him standing there in the lights watching me leave. The whole drive home, I was sending voice texts and regular texts to everyone saying I was right, that I knew he was going to come out of nowhere. None of that was a prank anymore. The next day, I texted my boss and told him exactly what happened. I said I wasn't doing overnights anymore. He looked at the footage later, and his response honestly made me even angrier. He got kind of defensive and said the guy looked like a regular customer to him. He said maybe I had just gotten spooked because of the phone calls and connected things that weren't connected. That pissed me off more than I can explain. I was the one there. I was the one getting the calls. I was the one who saw that guy disappear around the building and come speed walking at me out of nowhere when I left. I didn't care if the footage didn't fully capture how it felt because I knew what happened. I quit right after that. I didn't even argue much. I just told him if he thought that was normal, he could work the closing shift himself. I ended that job with attitude, and I was proud of it. Even now, many years later, I still think the caller and that guy who came in were the same person, even if I can't prove it. My name is Cadence. I work the closing shift at a small dive bar in the quieter part of my town. The place is right off the highway, but the parking lot also has a back entrance that's available to the general town. It's nothing fancy, just a dimly lit spot where the regulars know each other by name, and the jukebox has been playing the same rotation of classic rock for years. Most of our customers are locals, truckers passing through, and the occasional lost tourist looking for a stiff drink. I like it though. The routine is predictable, the tips are surprisingly decent, and I've learned how to handle the usual bar crowd. The talkers, the flirters, the quiet drinkers, and the ones who just want to be left alone. Weekends are obviously a lot more hectic, but the thing about working during the week is that I'm expected to work my night shifts alone. I don't even get a bar back to pop in now and again. Yeah, it's obviously easier work and slower during the week, but I miss the company of my coworkers. I tend to be pretty vigilant during my shifts because we do get the occasional bar fight considering the kinds of crowds we attract. That's why I clocked the guy immediately. It was sometime after 1 in the morning on a Tuesday when he walked in. If I had to guess, I'd say he was in his late 40s, but he was extremely clean cut and well groomed. Not the kind of look you'd expect from a guy his age in an area like this. He was wearing a black turtleneck underneath a black trench coat, definitely well dressed, but casual about it. I'm not sure how to explain it, but he had this aura of sophistication about him that makes you think of money. Real money, not the loud look at me kind. He glanced around slowly before walking swiftly over to the bar and taking a seat.
I also remember him having oddly good posture, but that's neither here nor there. When I walked over, he glanced at the bottles behind me and ordered something top shelf without hesitation. As I was pouring his drink, he asked me if I liked working here with a smile on his face. It was a normal enough question, so I answered him honestly. I told him yeah and smiled back. I then made a joke about being a bartender or something. I wish I could say I got a creepy vibe from him, but that's not the energy he was giving off. He genuinely seemed like a stand-up guy, kind of like the single dad at his kid's baseball game that gives the whole team a high five. He chatted with me for a bit, which I didn't mind since the bar was pretty quiet at that point. Eventually, he asked me if I ever thought about doing something bigger, which I admit was somewhat bizarre. Again though, not a totally creepy question given the nature of the situation. I gave him my standard bartender smile and told him I was happy for now. He nodded and sipped his drink, seemingly disappointed at my answer for reasons I didn't understand. After a long pause, he asked me what time I got off out of nowhere. That question surprised me. I hadn't picked up any kind of flirting from him whatsoever, so I was a little disappointed to discover that our conversation had just been another one of those empty attempts at getting my number. I smiled and gave him a vague answer, trying to brush him off in a friendly way without seeming uptight. Before he could answer, I busied myself and began wiping down the counter, but he didn't press. He just smiled like he already knew, then drained his drink and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, laying it gently on the bar like it was nothing. Then, without another word, he walked out into the night. I didn't really know what to make of the encounter. I know it sounds like nothing, but his demeanor was just so far off my radar that I was intrigued. Either way, I figured I was never going to see him again and got on with my life. As it would turn out though, I was wrong. About a week later, he came back. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him. She drew my attention since I hadn't seen her before. She looked like she was in her mid-30s and was dressed in a way that didn't quite match her age. Trendy, but off, like someone trying a little too hard to blend in with a younger crowd. I watched her closely as the two of them approached the bar. Everything about her seemed calculated, from the way she smiled too easily to the way she leaned against the bar like we were already friends. As I was setting down napkins in front of them, the very first thing she said to me wasn't a hello or a drink order, but a compliment. She put on this overly joyful smile and said, "You're so pretty." Her fingers brushed against my arm as she said it, lingering just a second longer than normal. I laughed and thanked her, but I could instantly tell that something was off about this woman. The man didn't speak, which I thought was also a little strange given that he had been so talkative last time. They ordered drinks and poured them, and that's when questions came flooding in. The woman asked me how long I'd been working here, along with how old I was and a bunch of other small talk questions like that. I answered in short, polite sentences, but I got the sense that this wasn't small talk. She was studying me. At one point, she looked over at the man, and it seemed like they were communicating despite not speaking. She looked back at me and told me that she ran an exclusive event club. She leaned in a bit as she said it, lowering her voice as if to prevent her being overheard by another patron. She told me that she's always looking for young, fun people for private parties, and that I'd make a killing, 10 grand for a weekend. I let out a small, forced laugh and told her it sounded too good to be true. She insisted that it was real, and told me that a bunch of girls like me worked for them. Her smile never faltered at any moment, which was starting to creep me out. She steered the conversation back to the job, circling around the same words. Fun, safe, exclusive. Then, casually, she said, "You should step outside for a second. There's someone who can explain it better." My pulse kicked up. I wasn't playing around at that point. I didn't even bother pretending like I wasn't creeped out. "I'm good," I said in a firm voice. No smile on my face this time. Just then, a group of customers walked in, laughing and talking loudly. The woman's expression changed in an instant, her friendly mask slipping just slightly before she turned to the man beside her. Without another word, they left. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't unsettled after that. Those random people had just propositioned me for God knows what. I told my coworkers and my boss about the situation, and we all agreed to keep an eye out should those people return. My boss assured me that he was always a 15-minute drive away should I need him, and the bar's security cameras were typically enough to deter any misbehavior. There wasn't really much I could do beyond that. It's not like those people had done anything illegal. I tried to push it out of my head, but a few nights later, after closing, I saw the car. It was parked across the street, engine off, just sitting there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin like static. As I walked to my car, I kept my head down, my keys clutched tight in my hand. When I pulled out of the lot, I checked my mirrors. The car followed. It stayed back just enough to avoid suspicion, but every turn I made, it was still there. I took a random turn onto a side street, and it followed. Another, still there. I started freaking out internally. I knew it was them. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. Then, without hesitating, I navigated and pulled into the parking lot of a police station, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles practically turned white. The second I pulled in, the car sped off. Nothing happened after that for a while, but I knew it wasn't over. It turned out I was right. It was a slow weekday shift, barely anyone coming in. By midnight, I was wiping down the counter, half thinking about closing early, when the door creaked open. It was the woman. I immediately sent my boss a text as inconspicuously as I possibly could. I looked back up, and the woman was staring at me with that same artificial smile. She walked slowly to the bar and sat down with her hands folded neatly. I was debating just telling her to leave when she said, "Thought I'd come check on you." My stomach started twisting, but I did my best to hide it. I told her we were about to close and that she had to leave, but she made this pouty face and asked for just one old-fashioned. I thought about denying her, but I figured pouring the drink would stall her long enough for my boss to arrive. So I turned around and got started, trying to keep my cool. And then I heard it. The soft, unmistakable click of the front door shutting. I whipped around. The woman was gone. I felt this awful pit in my stomach as I stepped toward the entrance. Through the glass, I saw it. A black van idling just outside. Without thinking, I locked the door as quickly as I could. But then, metal rattling from the back door. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't think. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could, a metal shaker, and clutched it like a weapon as I dialed 911 with my other hand. There was no way the police would get there in time, so I thought about making a run for it out the front door, but I didn't for whatever reason. I was bracing myself for a fight when I saw headlights pulling into the lot. It was my boss. The sounds on the back door suddenly stopped, and a few seconds later, the van pulled out of the lot with a screech. I embraced my boss and told him what had happened, and he said he had gotten the license plate of the van as it was leaving. When the cops arrived, my boss reviewed the security footage with them. It was worse than I had imagined. Just before the woman left, the cameras had captured two masked figures crouching near the front door, waiting. There was another person in the back who was banging on the door with his fist, clearly trying to flush me out to the front. It was downright horrifying. To make matters worse, the plate number my boss had caught turned out to be unregistered. It's been quite a while since this incident, but no progress has been made. The only good news to come out of the whole thing is that my boss doesn't make me work alone anymore. Despite that, I'm still extremely uneasy anytime I'm scheduled for a night shift. I still question how they knew I'd be working alone. It doesn't make any sense. Even now, I often think about what would have happened had I given in to fear and run out the front door. I used to work the night shift at a gas station / convenience store off a quiet stretch of highway. I say used to because after what happened to me a few months ago, I won't work a night shift again. It's a small station, the kind that barely gets any business once it gets late. Most of my shift was spent restocking shelves, wiping down counters, and occasionally ringing up a trucker or traveler passing through. I remember the whole thing vividly. It was just past 2:30 in the morning. By then, even the truckers had mostly dried up, and I was left with basically nothing to do. I scrolled mindlessly on my phone, trying to kill some time. At one point, I stepped outside for some air, rubbing my hands together against the cold. I exhaled a few times, watching my breath disappear in the cold. The parking lot was empty, just the pumps, the road, and the dark stretch of trees beyond. The neon sign flickered faintly, and I remember it being hazy out, like you could literally see the moisture in the air. Even with the highway not too far off, it was pretty silent out there. Right as I was about to walk back towards the store, I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around and realized there was a person standing behind one of the pumps. How had I not noticed him earlier? He was wearing a dark red hoodie with a hood up, and he had both hands shoved in his pockets. There wasn't a car in sight, so he obviously wasn't fueling up. The only thing was, he didn't seem to be heading towards the store either. He was just standing there, half turned toward the store like he was watching me. At first, I figured maybe he was waiting for someone, but something about the way he moved rubbed me the wrong way. He was kind of shuffling about in this circular pattern. I entered the store, but made sure to keep an eye on him through the glass. I kept track of him while pretending not to, hoping someone would drive up and pick him up or something. But after a few minutes, he started walking toward the door. Slow at first, then suddenly pushing inside like he'd made up his mind all at once. He walked up to the counter, but didn't say anything right away, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. Then, in a rushed, almost rehearsed way, he muttered that his car had broken down just before the pumps. He said he needed a jump, or maybe just a little gas to get to the next town. I was literally shocked. He wasn't even trying to make his story believable. Like, I couldn't believe he actually expected me to buy his BS story. I offered to call a tow truck instead. No, he said, too quick, shaking his head. He just needed a flashlight, maybe some help checking under the hood. Something was definitely off, that much was true. The way he spoke, the way he watched my reaction, it felt like a test. To be fair though, people walking into gas stations at that hour are usually a little strange, and I started wondering whether he actually needed help and was just an odd person or on something. I asked him where his car was parked, and he told me it was just beyond the highway entrance. I was obviously skeptical, but then he pointed at the monitor behind me. I turned to look at the screen, and to my surprise, there actually was a car parked out there. I thought to myself, oh crap, maybe this guy really does need help. And that's when it hit me. I had literally just been outside, and I would have remembered a car parked out there. I glanced back at the monitor, and saw the slightest movement near the car's back bumper. Someone was crouching just out of view. A cold wave of dread hit me. I forced a casual smile and agreed to help the guy, but not before telling him I needed to grab my phone from the back office. I turned slowly, not wanting to spook him. But the second I was out of his direct sight, I slammed my hand onto the emergency panic button under the counter. The alarm went off instantly, screeching through the store. I expected him to attack me, but what he did instead was even more unsettling. His nervous energy disappeared. No more fake urgency, no more shifting from foot to foot. He actually relaxed. His whole body language shifted, and then he smiled. Not a panicked smile, not an embarrassed one either. A slow, knowing grin, like he had all the time in the world, like this was amusing to him. I was in shock. I didn't even have time to get physical with him. In one fluid motion, he turned and bolted. I ran to the monitors just in time to see both of them take off. Not toward the car, but into the woods behind the station. The car just sat there, engine off, headlights off. No one inside. By the time the police arrived, it was exactly as I saw it. The car was still there, but the men were gone. No footprints leading away, no sign of them anywhere. And then one of the officers pointed something out. Something I hadn't noticed before. The front passenger door was open. There had been a third person inside the whole time. The police took my statement down, I turned over the surveillance footage, and that was that. A few days later, they followed up with me. They had the car towed and ran the plates. Turned out, it had been reported stolen nearly a week earlier, over 100 miles away. No one had come forward to claim it, no reports of missing persons, no other crimes linked to it, just an abandoned vehicle in the middle of nowhere with no explanation. That was months ago, and still nothing. I don't know why convenience stores are such popular targets, but I can say for sure that I will never work another night shift again. This happened a couple weeks ago. I work the night shift at Walmart. It's not the worst job in the world, but after a while, it starts to feel like you're just floating through time. The nights blend together. Same shelves, same routine, same dull hum of the overhead lights. Hopefully something better comes along. I usually hang out in and stock the electronics section, which is nice because it's quieter than the other areas. People don't exactly come rushing in at 2 a.m. to buy phone chargers and Bluetooth speakers. Most of the customers are either night owls killing time or truckers grabbing last-minute supplies before heading back on the road. That's why I noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another guy wandering the aisles, probably waiting for someone. But after a few minutes, I realized he wasn't shopping. He wasn't even pretending to. He just kept appearing. Every time I glanced up, he was lingering nearby, hovering in the next aisle over or standing a little too still by the clearance section. He wasn't looking at anything. He was just standing there, watching me. I told myself I was overthinking it. The store is big and maybe he was just taking his time. But the way he moved, Always just close enough for me to notice, never actually picking anything up. It set something deep in my gut on edge. I was waiting for him to just get on with it and ask for my number, but he never approached me. It was like he wanted me to see him, which didn't make any sense to me. I went to radio someone about it, but realized that the batteries in my radio must have been dead because it wasn't working. Eventually, I started debating whether I should go find a manager when I felt a hand wrap around my arm. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but before I could react, a woman's voice rang out loud, friendly, overly familiar. She exclaimed, "There you are," before going on a little spiel about how she had been looking all over for me. I turned, completely thrown off, and saw a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was smiling, her grip firm on my arm, like we were old friends reuniting. Before I could say anything, she leaned in and whispered, her tone dropping to something low and urgent. "That guy's been recording you. Follow me." My stomach dropped. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance back. The man was still there, only now, he wasn't even pretending to browse. He was staring right at me. A cold wave of fear crept over me. I let her pull me. I didn't even question it. The way she grabbed my arm, the way she spoke so loud and casually, like we were two old friends reuniting, I clung to it. I was beyond grateful that someone had realized what was going on and put herself in an uncomfortable position just to help me. She kept up the act as we walked, rambling about something, maybe a trip she had taken, maybe an inside joke we supposedly shared. I barely processed the words. My thoughts were stuck on him. Had he really been recording me? That was creepy as hell. I wanted to know if he was still following us, but I couldn't muster the courage to turn around just yet. The woman steered me through the aisles, moving fast. I barely noticed where we were going, only that we were going, that the distance between me and that man was growing. In all honesty, I was kind of expecting her to quit the pretending to know me at some point, but she kept it up. At one point, it was getting a little uncomfortable, so I glanced behind me, and to my relief, that man was no longer following. The woman kept pulling me forward, though. I told her that we were good now and that we should probably go find my manager, but she just squeezed my arm tighter, telling me that he was lurking somewhere. I thought to myself, so what? What's he gonna do in a store full of employees? I was obviously worried at first because no one was around, but now that I wasn't alone, I started realizing that there wasn't much of a point in being scared anymore. I told her this, but she continued moving. I told her I was serious and planted my feet, twisting my arm slightly to loosen her grip. "You can let go now," I said, but she didn't. She smiled at me, but something in it was off. "Come on, just a little further," she said, basically tugging me at that point. I glanced around. The store was basically dead. We had moved past the registers, past the self-checkout, past the aisles that saw the most foot traffic. The warehouse section loomed ahead, dimly lit and nearly empty. Beyond that was the side exit, the one without cameras, the one employees used for loading shipments. That's when it dawned on me. She was leading me straight to the exit. I didn't think. I screamed for help as I yanked my arm free of her grasp with all my might. She lost her grip just enough for me to pull free. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran toward the front of the store. As I fled, she yelled out something behind me. She yelled for me to come back, followed by my name, which I hadn't given her. I kept running until I saw one of my coworkers who was running toward me, most likely reacting to my screaming. I told him to call security, which he promptly did. That woman was long gone, though. By the time I told my story to the security guards, that woman and that man were nowhere in sight. They reviewed the security footage, and just as I suspected, the woman and man walked into the store together. She had been with him the entire time. The man's face was clear as day in one of the frames, but hers was always turned away. I had a feeling she was the mastermind behind the whole thing, so I was infuriated that the cameras hadn't picked her face up. Every second of it had been planned. The police got involved, and the whole thing went down as a failed abduction attempt. I'm still waiting for a resolution about it. That man should definitely be easy to track down, given his face was caught on camera. I have no idea how that woman knew my name. That's what terrifies me the most. Those people hadn't just picked me at random. I was a direct target.
This happened when I was 15 years old. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I wasn't old enough to get many on-the-books jobs, so I would occasionally babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and found an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. The post explained that she worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep before I arrived and would remain asleep most of the night. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like an easy job. I emailed the woman and got a response about an hour later. She asked for my phone number and called me that evening, and she sounded completely normal. She spoke calmly and answered all my questions. She explained that she had to leave for work before I would arrive, so she would hide a key outside the house. She told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before agreeing to anything. The woman spent several minutes speaking to my mom on the phone. Whatever they discussed seemed to satisfy my mom because afterward, she told me it sounded like a great idea. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by large trees. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed every light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked to the front porch and checked the hiding spot the woman had described. The key was exactly where she said it would be. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. After setting my backpack down, I turned around and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. Inside was a pretty standard house at first glance. There were family photos on the walls, and a few toys sat near the living room couch. I saw a pink backpack leaning against a chair. There were kids' drawings attached to the fridge with magnets. Everything seemed ordinary. Still, I wanted to know the layout of the house, so I walked through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway leading towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. What I was not expecting to see was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window looking out it, but that fact quickly made the sight more unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing to look at. I stared for several seconds before finally speaking. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was a smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth were missing. I asked who he was, and his smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed out of the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She answered after a few rings, and I explained that there was a man in one of the bedrooms. She sounded confused for a second before acting like she suddenly remembered. That part of it really still sticks with me. Then she explained that it was her brother who had dementia and sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he's harmless. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. If her brother was living there, he should have been mentioned in the ad or on our phone call. Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there for another minute just contemplating my situation. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing remained open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me nervous. I continued farther down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one. Locked. I tried the second one. Locked. The third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The room appeared empty. I couldn't see much because the lights were off. I pushed the door a little farther. It was just an empty room. Feeling stupid for being scared, I continued toward the guest room. As I passed the fridge again, I noticed something strange. The drawings attached to it looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of the drawings had dust sitting on top of the magnet holding it in place. The backpack I'd seen earlier looked faded too. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually been in that house was. The thought made me uncomfortable. I realized that despite being there for almost half an hour, I still hadn't seen a single sign that Rose currently lived there. I hadn't heard her, and I hadn't seen her room. I hadn't even seen any recent toys. I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a small room. I set my backpack on the floor. Then I noticed something. There was no lock on the door. As I turned around to look back into the hallway, there was the man again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He was looking at me again, and his smile came back on his face. I hadn't heard him approach. It was like he just teleported there. I honestly don't know how long he had been standing there. The missing tooth was visible even from where I stood. For several seconds, we stared each other down, me looking at him like he was some confused animal and not even an actual person. Then I quickly stepped inside the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm myself down. I knew well of dementia from a young age, as my great-grandmother passed away with dementia. This allowed me to justify this man's actions. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. I called my mom 3 times until she finally picked up. I told her of the situation I was in, from the unannounced brother with dementia to the fact that I couldn't even find the child in the house. For a few moments, she was silent. Then she told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing that made me feel relieved and scared at the same time. Scared because even my mom thought something was up here. She hung up after she said she'd be there as fast as possible. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer until they stopped directly outside the door. Everything went silent, and I stared at the doorknob. I checked my phone, and the woman still hadn't called back to see if everything was okay. I decided to call her myself, but after 3 attempts, she never picked up. While I was waiting, the bedroom door opened a few inches. I couldn't see who was standing outside. The opening wasn't wide enough. I sat there staring at it. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was on the other side didn't enter. I knew it had to be the brother. It was those final, tense seconds where I decided I was getting out of there, and I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I crossed to the other side and kept going. I ended up nearly a block away before finally slowing down. I pulled out my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, a text message appeared. It was from the woman's number. The message simply asked where I was going. I immediately looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside or at the windows. I didn't see any cameras when I entered the house, yet somehow she knew I had left. That was when I became convinced something was seriously wrong. I called my mom and told her not to come directly to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, she pulled up. I jumped inside and locked the door, and we left immediately. Neither of us ever contacted the woman again. I never figured out who the man really was. I never figured out if Rose actually existed. I never figured out why all the bedroom doors were locked. There's a slight possibility that it was all real and that I was just extremely paranoid and dipped out, but the chances of that are slim to none. Something weird was going on in that house. When I was 15 or 16, I got a summer job cleaning units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through the property manager, who I used to babysit for, and for a high school student, it paid surprisingly well. The job was simple. Whenever a tenant moved out, we would go in and clean the unit to prepare it for the next family. Many of the units had been abandoned in a hurry. Belongings were often left behind, and some places looked as if people had simply gotten up and left one day. I worked alongside a university student I'll call Jen. She was about 20 or 21 and naturally took the lead while I followed her direction. One day, we were assigned a unit on the end of a row. The layout becomes important, so I'll explain it briefly. When you entered through the front door, you walked into the living room. On the right side were 2 sets of stairs, one leading up to the second floor and one behind a door leading down to the basement. The basement stairs turned twice, meaning you couldn't see into the basement from the main floor. The basement itself was just one large unfinished concrete room with a washer, dryer, furnace, and a single hanging light bulb. There were no closets, side rooms, alcoves, or places to hide. When we entered the unit, it was obvious the previous tenants had left in a hurry. The kitchen was filthy and most of their belongings were still there. We spent the first part of the afternoon packing everything into garbage bags and sorting items that could be donated. Once that was finished, we started cleaning. Part of the kitchen cleanup involved pulling the oven and fridge away from the walls and cleaning them thoroughly. We also removed the drawer underneath the oven. When it came time to put it back, we discovered the rails were damaged and it wouldn't slide in properly. For reasons that made sense at the time, Jen and I stood on opposite sides and kicked it until it wedged itself back underneath the oven. When we tried pulling it out again, it wouldn't budge. We both immediately regretted doing that, but we figured the property manager could deal with it later. After that, we split up. Jen headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms while I stayed downstairs removing the glass light fixtures so I could wash them. I was standing on a ladder in the living room
when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I called back, to no response. I climbed down and went upstairs. When I found Jen, she was cleaning a bedroom with headphones on. I asked what she wanted. She looked confused. "What, did you call me?" I said. She laughed and shook her head. "No." I shrugged it off and went back downstairs. One thing that always bothered me about that unit was the attic access above the staircase. It was just a square opening in the ceiling leading into a dark crawl space. The cover was missing, so every time I walked underneath it, I found myself looking up into a square of complete darkness. A few minutes later, I heard my name again. This time when I called back, Jen immediately yelled from upstairs, saying, "I didn't call you, you're hearing things." At the time, I agreed with her. It was strange, but I wasn't frightened. Not yet. A little while later, I was standing at the kitchen sink cleaning the light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge and nearly tripped. The oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the floor. Immediately, I thought it was odd. Jen and I had practically kicked the thing into place. We'd also confirmed afterward that it was completely stuck. Still, I just kicked it back in. It took several hard kicks before it wedged itself under the oven again. To make sure, I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing, it was stuck. Satisfied, I went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I turned around again and almost tripped. The drawer was back out. I hadn't heard anything. Nobody else was downstairs. This time, I felt genuinely unsettled. The drawer hadn't simply slid out. It had been jammed into place. I left it where it was and decided it was the property manager's problem. When I checked on Jen, she was still upstairs cleaning, so I returned to my own work. Eventually, I started reinstalling the clean light fixtures. Since it was a bright summer afternoon, I turned the lights off while I worked. I was standing on a small ladder trying to secure one of the fixtures when the lights suddenly switched on. The sudden brightness startled me, and I fell backward on the ladder. A second later, the fixture slipped from my hands and came crashing down. It narrowly missed hitting me in the head. For a few seconds, I just sat there on the floor. I could see the light switch from where I had fallen. Nobody was near it. At the same time, I could clearly hear Jen moving around upstairs. Only a few seconds had passed. There was no possible way she could have run downstairs, turned on the light, and gotten back upstairs. The switch had somehow turned on by itself. At least that's what it looked like. I still wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I was just uncomfortable. At that point, I decided I was done working alone and went upstairs to find Jen. When I told her what happened, she looked uneasy. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. A few minutes earlier, she thought she'd heard someone call her name too. It didn't sound like me. We were both officially creeped out. The only task left was sweeping the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down there alone, so we went together. The basement was exactly as I described earlier. One large open concrete room with nowhere to hide. While Jen swept, I sat on the dryer and talked with her. A few minutes later, we finished and headed back upstairs. We were relieved to be almost done. We started gathering our supplies in the living room. I was standing maybe 2 feet from the open basement door when it happened. From below us came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Both of us froze. The footsteps were loud enough that neither of us questioned what we were hearing. Then came something far worse. The footsteps suddenly broke into a run. They were charging up the stairs, fast and loud, coming directly toward us. The footsteps got louder. I looked at Jen, and her face had gone completely white. Neither of us said a word. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the basement door and slammed it shut as hard as I could. Then Jen and I ran. We flew out the front door and across the lawn. At one point, I heard Jen yell behind me, "The key!" I yelled back, "Leave it!" Neither of us stopped until we were on the other side of the complex. I barely remember what happened afterward. Eventually, we returned to the property manager and told her someone had been inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and never went back. As far as I know, she contacted the police before anyone entered the condo. We never told her what we had actually experienced. What could we say? That something invisible had spent the entire afternoon calling our names? Moving objects around? Turning lights on and finally charging up the basement stairs? It sounded ridiculous. Even now, I'm not someone who believes every strange story is paranormal. I've had other experiences in my life that could probably be explained one way or another. This one is different, though. Maybe we imagined hearing our names. Maybe there was some mechanical explanation for the oven drawer. Maybe the light switch malfunctioned. But that basement was empty. There was nowhere for anybody to hide. And those footsteps weren't distant or ambiguous. They sounded exactly like someone running up a staircase directly toward us. Even now, more than 20 years later, hearing someone run up a set of stairs sends me right back to that summer afternoon. I'm still a skeptic, but I never have been able to explain what happened in that condo. When I was younger, I was a hustler and a go-getter, always looking for the next way to make a quick buck, and my mom knew an older couple from a church group who needed help around their property for a couple of weeks. Their names were Richard and Elaine, and they were both in their late 60s, old but not super old. They lived in a pretty rural area about 40 minutes away from my house. They were in one of those older farmhouses with a long gravel driveway and woods behind the property. The deal was simple, but I would stay there for a little over a week, help Richard with yard work, cleaning out the garage, moving furniture, painting a fence, things like that, and they would pay me at the end. My mom trusted them because she knew Richard from years back, and Elaine seemed really sweet the first time I met her. She was quiet, but she smiled a lot and kept asking if I was hungry. The house itself was fine. It was what you'd expect an elderly couple to live in a quiet area. Upstairs at the end of the hall was the room I'd be sleeping. On my first day there, Richard showed me around the property and then gave me a verbal list of things we'd work on, and Elaine made dinner. I noticed early on that Elaine didn't talk much, but she always had a neutral to half smile on her face. She asked my name 3 different times, to which Richard just said she forgets things sometimes. I figured he meant normal old person forgetfulness, so I didn't think much of it. That night, I went upstairs around 11 and tried to sleep. Sometime around probably 3 in the morning, I woke up and heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking back and forth outside my room. I knew it. The floorboards creaked every few seconds. Maybe Richard was going to the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't go anywhere. They just passed my door, went down the hall, turned around, and came back. I laid there in the dark listening to it for maybe 10 minutes, and it got increasingly uncomfortable until they seemed to stop right outside the door. I stared at the big, dark gap under the door, and I felt like I could see the outline of 2 feet. After a while, the footsteps moved away again, which confirmed that what I was seeing was in fact 2 outlines of feet. The next morning, I mentioned it to Richard while we were outside working. He didn't look surprised. He just said Elaine sometimes wandered at night because she had bad dreams and got confused, and that I shouldn't worry about it. When I asked if I should lock my door at night, he kind of laughed and said the guest room didn't have a lock because the house was old, so I let it go. But the second night was worse. I woke up again to the same footstep sounds, except this time they were faster. I could hear Elaine muttering to herself in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard my name once, which gave me goosebumps. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times. I was starting to hate that large gap under the door. The doorknob twisted, stopped, and the door opened about an inch. It stayed open a crack for just a moment, and I heard a whispering voice through the crack, but I couldn't make out what was said. Then the door shut again. After that, I had trouble sleeping like I think anyone would in my shoes. In the morning, I told Richard exactly what happened. Once again, he explained it away. His explanation was she probably thought the room was empty and that she had been doing things like that more lately. He said it was embarrassing for her and asked me not to bring it up around Elaine. During the day, she seemed mostly normal, doing things like making lunch, folding towels, and watering plants, which made the whole thing harder to process. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room with this flat, suspicious look. It was like she didn't recognize me, but also didn't like that I was there. On the 4th day, Richard and I were cleaning out a shed behind the house. I noticed a dented metal walker shoved behind some boxes, and next to it was a broken picture frame with dried brown stains on the glass. This is kind of important for later. Later on that same day, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long scratch on the hallway wall, about chest height, like something had been dragged across it. There were also small holes in one of the doors downstairs, like someone had hit it with something. These all seemed like signs of struggle. That night, I put my suitcase in front of my bedroom door. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone, but I figured it would at least make noise if the door opened. Around 2:30, I woke up to the sound of the suitcase scraping across the floor. I looked and saw my bedroom door was halfway open. Elaine was standing in the doorway in her nightgown. I saw her mouth hung open as she was heavily mouth-breathing. I said her name, trying not to sound scared, even though the sight was horrifying. When she stepped into the room, that was when I saw she was holding a kitchen knife at her side. She walked closer to the bed and started whispering something, which I quickly was able to understand as,
"You don't belong here." She said it like 5 times. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." She came all the way to the side of the bed and stood over me with the knife hanging in her hand. I yelled for Richard as loud as I could. Elaine flinched like the sound scared her. Then she turned and marched out of the room. Even the stiff way she marched out of the room was terrifying. She slammed the door and marched away. Richard came upstairs maybe 30 seconds later, acting annoyed, like I had woken him up for no reason. I told him she had been in my room with a knife. He kept saying she wouldn't hurt anyone and that she wasn't herself at night. This was officially when him downplaying her behavior began to piss me off. I said I wanted to go home, and he replied it was 3 in the morning and my mom was probably asleep. He said we'll talk about it in the morning. I should have called my mom right there, but I didn't want to make the situation bigger. I pushed the dresser in front of the door after he left and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, Elaine acted like nothing happened. She made pancakes and was smiling again, giving normal grandmother vibes. Richard pulled me aside and apologized, but it didn't feel like a real apology. He said Elaine's memory had been getting worse, which sounded like an understatement. When I asked him if she had ever attacked anyone before, he took a pause. Then he said she had gotten upset with a caregiver once, but that it was handled. That was the first time I realized he had definitely been hiding things from me. I told him a second time that I wanted to leave. He said he understood, but my mom was at work until late and he would drive me home the next morning after we finished one last job and they paid me. That afternoon, while Richard was outside on the phone, I went looking for my backpack because I wanted to pack early. For some reason, I found it in the laundry room. On my backpack, there was a blood stain clear as day, right on the outer pocket. I called Richard into the room and showed him the blood. He grabbed the backpack, looking a little more angry than I'd seen yet, and he told me he accidentally cut himself earlier and moved my backpack in there while he cleaned up the blood. He finished it off with a "stop worrying." I told him I was calling my mom, and he once again tried to get me to calm down. I went upstairs, packed my bag, and tried calling anyway. The call failed twice, so I texted her to come get me, but it didn't send. Richard also refused to give me the Wi-Fi password. That was when I really started to feel trapped. I had to tank through until she came the next morning. The final night, I didn't even get in bed. I sat fully dressed on the top of the blanket with my shoes on and my bag next to me. I moved the dresser in front of the door again, but around midnight, Richard came upstairs and told me to move it because it was dangerous in case of a fire. I refused at first, and for the first time, I heard him yell. He told me to move the dresser now. I complied and moved it just enough so the door could open. After he left, I waited in the dark with my phone in hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elaine downstairs. She was yelling this time. It sounded like she was yelling at Richard. Then I heard glass break. Richard said her name, trying to calm her down, and then there was a loud thud, followed by him shouting in pain. It sounded like she just attacked him. I got up and cracked my door open. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from the staircase from downstairs. Footsteps started coming up the stairs fast. I shut my door and pushed the dresser back as hard as I could. A few seconds later, Elaine hit the door from the other side. The doorknob rattled violently, and she started saying again and again that I didn't belong here. She sounded furious. The door shook as she hit it again and again, and I heard something metal strike the wood, and a piece of the door splintered inward. My sights landed on the window, my only exit, and I decided I was jumping out. I could hear Richard downstairs groaning and calling for her. Whatever she did to him, she was about to do to me, maybe worse. I got the window up and kicked out the screen. There was a small roof over the porch below the window, so I climbed out onto it with my backpack. Elaine was still banging on the door when I jumped out. I dropped from the porch roof into the bushes below. I ran down the gravel driveway without looking back. I could hear the front door open behind me, and Elaine was yelling from the porch. She was holding what I could only guess was a fireplace poker in one hand. I kept running until I reached the road, where I finally was able to call 911 with service. The police and an ambulance showed up maybe 15 minutes later. Richard had a cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to stop her. Elaine was taken away by paramedics. The police got a hold of my mom, and she arrived as soon as she could. Richard later told my mom that Elaine had been getting worse for months, but he didn't want to put her in a facility because he felt guilty. He thought he could manage it himself. He also admitted she attacked 2 caregivers before me. If he wasn't an old man, my mom likely would have slapped him in the face after she heard all that. I still think about how many chances I had to leave, and how many times I ignored the obvious signs because I didn't want to seem dramatic. Honestly, I feel like we as humans try to hold out our hope that things are still normal for as long as possible, that we really don't see the actual danger we can be in until it's almost too late.
This story is from when I was a senior in high school. Back then, I was a rebellious teenager, but only when it came to my family. I was not a bad kid by any means, just a punk when it came to my family. I had a loving family, but I was that kid who was too cool to spend time with them. They always expected me to entertain my little brother Jake, who was only 10 years old at the time of the story. I was 8 years older than him. With that age difference, we may as well have been different species. Whenever we would take trips, my family would usually stay somewhere on or near the ocean. We only lived about 5 hours from the coast, so it was an easy trip. This specific year, they decided to take a trip to Maine. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful, and as an adult, I would love to go back. But as an 18-year-old, I thought that this was the worst trip we could ever take. Before I continue the story, let me just acknowledge that I know how much of a piece of garbage I was back then. Even as I write this, I can't believe how much of a little punk I was. We got to the house, and it was incredible. It looked like something out of a Stephen King novel, which was fitting because we were in Maine. It was a massive white house with green shutters that was deep within the trees. My dad even made the joke, "This is how most horror movies start, isn't it?" Probably not the best thing to say in front of a 10-year-old, but my brother didn't care. He was just as mesmerized by the house as I was. Inside the house was almost like a maze. The back center of the house was a huge living room that had an awesome view of a forest behind the house. The rest of the house had all these hallways that intersected in places that strangely didn't make sense. It was like a house you would design in The Sims, and not something you'd see in real life. The weirdest part of this place was not the hallways, it was that the house connected to a small adjoining house. The house where the owner of the property we were staying at lived. His name was Hugh. He was, let's say, strange. He was tall and wore this very old, sweat-stained bucket hat. His teeth were very yellow, but it wasn't his physical characteristics that stood out. It was his personality. He was goofy and loud, a bit eccentric even. He welcomed my family and acted very friendly toward us. He kept referring to how kind folks from Maine were. My family's polite and nodded along with him while he was talking to them. He told us that he was right next door if we needed anything, and other than that, we wouldn't hear or see him for the entire week. We weren't thrilled about having this person basically in the same house as us, but there was nothing we could do now, and we just decided to make the best of it. Well, my family decided to make the best of it. I was being the worst and telling my family that I wanted to leave. I was looking for any excuse to leave and come home. The first morning there, while we were eating breakfast, my parents told us that we were going on this great hike. I told them that I didn't want to go. After a little back and forth, they decided to let me stay at the house, and the three of them were going to go on the hike. The main reason I didn't want to go was that right before vacation, I had just started dating this girl, Danny, and I wanted to talk to her. I knew if I went on the hike, I wouldn't get service, so I ditched my family to text my high school girlfriend. I was telling Danny about the house and sending her pictures of the weird layout. When I told her about the adjoining house, she didn't believe me. I told her I was going to send her a video to prove it. At the end of one of the hallways was a door. I sent her a video telling her that behind that door is Hugh's house. She still didn't believe me, so I sent her a video. I went to open the door, assuming it would be locked, and it wasn't. The worst part of this was that the door to Hugh's was right next to the door to my bedroom. This guy's unlocked door that was right next to where I would be sleeping. I didn't love that. I ended up walking inside Hugh's house while on FaceTime with Danny. It was just a normal little house. The room I was in had a TV and a couch, nothing spectacular. I heard a door shut from somewhere in the house, and I panicked and ran back to our side of the house. A few minutes later, Hugh was knocking at the door. He was still cheerful and goofy and asked why I was recording videos of his house. I tried lying and telling him that I was just lost, but he didn't believe me. He also didn't seem that mad. He told me that he had cameras in his house and he got alerted to one of the doors opening. When he checked it, he had me on video flashing my phone all over the room. I just told him the truth after that, and he laughed. He made some weird comment about how nobody in Maine locks their doors. I laughed awkwardly and said I had to go. He left, and you better believe I locked the door. Maybe people in Maine don't lock their doors, but where I'm from, you lock the doors and check twice.
Danny told me that she didn't trust this guy and that I needed to protect myself just in case. I carried a large wooden chair over to the door and basically propped it against the door as a makeshift lock. When my family came back, I told them about the weird interaction with Hugh, but they were more angry with me that I went into his house. They were right, but I still yelled at them anyway. My parents had only been back for maybe 30 or 40 minutes and told me to get ready because we were going out for dinner. Again, I protested and said I wasn't leaving. My parents were still a little upset about the Hugh thing, so they didn't bother fighting with me. They told me that they would bring food home for me. Not long after they were gone, the sun went down. I looked out the windows and it was pitch black, like no light at all. A couple of hours later, I was sitting on the couch texting Danny when I heard a loud crash. I sprang up right away. It sounded like it came from the end of the hall where Hugh's door was locked. I started putting pieces together in my head, and I concluded that the sound very well could have been the sound of the big wooden chair being knocked over. My first thought was that Hugh was trying to get in. I snuck over to the hallway, wanting to catch this creep in the act. It was too dark to see at the end of the hall. I flipped the light switch, and the chair was knocked over, and on the ground next to the chair was a backpack that wasn't mine. I ran to the screened-in front porch, locked the door that led to the inside of the house, and made sure the screen door to the outside was locked. I know it's not exactly a fortress, but it would at least give me time to make a move if I needed to. I sat in the fetal position on the ground under a patio table. I didn't know what to do, and of course, I left my phone in the living room where I was texting Danny. I heard footsteps coming from inside the house. Not erratic movements, just normal walking. I don't know exactly how long had passed, but it was at least several minutes when I saw the headlight of my dad's van pulling in. I got up, ran outside, and told them to stay in the car. My parents were confused because I was speaking incoherently about what happened. That's when Hugh came over, and I just about fell on the ground. He leaned over to my dad and said he needed to talk to him in private. I tried pulling my dad back, but he basically just dismissed me. I could tell by Hugh's body language that something was wrong. He wasn't being gleeful and silly anymore. He looked like he had seen a ghost. My dad shook Hugh's hand, turned to me, and told me to get into the van. He said that we needed to go somewhere quickly. My little brother was confused, and I could tell my dad was freaked out. My dad drove away from the house and to the grocery store parking lot about a mile down the road. Just minutes later, we saw several police cars drive by the parking lot. We all started yelling at my dad to tell us what was going on, and he was honest with us and told us everything. Hugh also heard the loud noise. He got an alert that his camera had been set off. The chair that I was using as a lock must have had enough of an impact on the door when it was knocked over that it registered movement on Hugh's camera. He assumed I was trying to get inside his house again. He thought that maybe I was trying to pull some kind of high school prank. He checked the cameras and didn't see anything. He said he had a gut feeling that something was wrong, so he decided to invade our privacy and check the camera that he had in the hallway of the house we were staying in. It was too dark to see anything until I turned the light on. He still only saw the knocked over chair and the backpack, which he thought could be mine. Just as he was about to turn the camera off, he saw a tall, bald man come out of the bedroom I was staying in. A man he knew wasn't my dad and wasn't me. The man grabbed the backpack and went back into the room. Hugh ran outside immediately to help me and noticed that's right when I had locked the screen door and ducked down. He was smart enough to assume that I probably wouldn't have believed him, and he was right. I wouldn't have. Instead, Hugh hid in the front yard with a clear vantage point of the house, just in case this intruder tried anything. He didn't want to sneak in through the adjoining house and potentially alert the intruder, because he thought that might put me in danger. As soon as my family returned, he told my dad everything, and that's why we ran off. We were only in the parking lot for a few minutes when Hugh called and said that the police chased the man into the woods and they hadn't caught him yet. He told us to remain there and that he would grab all our things and bring them to us. We stayed at a hotel that night and drove home the next morning. If I hadn't acted like a spoiled kid and stayed at the house, all this could have played out much differently. It could have been a lot worse. A few months later, my dad reached out to Hugh and asked him if they ever caught the guy. They never did. Even with all Hugh's cameras around the property, they still didn't know how he got in or even what his intentions were. He could have just been a homeless man looking for shelter. At least that's what I told myself back then so I could sleep at night. Sometimes the scariest things that happen to us aren't always face-to-face interactions. Sometimes it's just people hiding in plain sight. Every year, my family goes on this epic vacation together. We stay at my aunt and uncle's house that's right on the ocean in West Palm Beach. Their son Will is the same age as me, and we've always been good friends. It's also not just my immediate family. My other aunt and uncle join us and bring their kids as well. Their daughter Teresa is my best friend. We went all through high school together, and because we're the same age, have the same last name, and kind of resemble each other, everybody thought we were twins. We would love these family vacations because we would tell strangers that we were twins. As we got older, Teresa, Will, and I would party like rock stars on these family vacations. We would spend the day on the beach with the family, but at night, Will would take us to bars and clubs. Because he was the local boy, he knew all the hot spots. On one specific family vacation from a few years ago, the three of us witnessed something weird, something that still bothers me and freaks me out to this day. Teresa and Will aren't so freaked out. They think what we witnessed was some kind of prank or just a weird occurrence. I'm just not so sure. The trip was like any other West Palm family vacation. We were living it up. Once in a while on these trips, Will would accidentally have a little too much to drink. Maybe it wasn't accidental. The boy liked his drinks. But because of this, Teresa and I would know exactly when he hit his limits. That's usually when we would call it a night and find a ride home. I was always responsible for us getting home. I would only drink to a certain point, and then spend the rest of the time making sure that Teresa, and especially Will, didn't end up in a ditch somewhere. On this specific night, Will started getting a little rowdy in one of the bars. He kept saying that because he was a local, he could run his mouth, but that's not a thing. He was making a lot of people inside the bar mad, and he ended up getting thrown out of the bar we were at. And I mean, he physically got thrown out of the bar by the bouncer. He was mumbling a little bit, but he was fine. He didn't hit his head or anything. I think his self-esteem was hurt more than anything. I told Teresa to watch him while I tried to find us an Uber or another way home. He kept calling me a buzzkill, and that's kind of how I knew it was time to go. I secured us a ride that would be there shortly. While we were waiting, I called my boyfriend and just told him about the night we were having. He laughed and told me to call him when I got back to the house. Just as I hung up the phone, Teresa ran over to me freaking out. She said she wasn't paying attention to Will while she was on her phone, and he got up and wandered off. The boy was in no condition to wander anywhere. I tried calling him, but his phone kept going right to voicemail, which is right on brand for Will. After a few minutes of running around the streets yelling his name, I heard Teresa shout at me that she could see him. Thankfully, it was Will. He was walking in a very crooked line and heading towards the swamp or forest or something. I don't know what you would call it in Florida. I don't know the difference between what qualifies as a forest or a swamp. It was a heavily wooded area with a lot of mud and dirt. I'm going to refer to it in the story as a swamp because I feel like that's more on brand for Florida. Anyway, Teresa grabbed him before we entered the swamp and started giving him a verbal beatdown. Will was laughing and acting like a toddler. As soon as Teresa let go of Will, he sprinted into the swamp. I don't know if it was adrenaline or rage, but without thinking, we sprinted into the woods after him. It only took us a little while to catch up. He was so messed up that he wasn't moving very fast. Using the flashlight from the cell phone, we were able to see just how dirty and gross this area was. Our feet were completely covered in mud. As we started heading out of the thick brush, Will, of all people, told us to shush. We both looked at him like we were going to smash him in the face, and before we could speak, he told us to be quiet again. He ducked down and looked scared. This was a completely different Will than 10 seconds ago. It didn't take us long to realize why Will got down. We heard shouting and screaming coming from somewhere in the swamp. It wasn't just normal screaming, at least to me. It didn't sound that way. It was like screams I've never heard before, and I haven't heard them since. The three of us just stayed quiet and stayed put while the sounds of these screams echoed all around us. We couldn't tell exactly where the screams were coming from, but whoever was screaming sounded like they were in trouble. Then, almost as abruptly as they started, the screams stopped. We didn't move. We stayed put in that muddy swamp for at least another 15 minutes. Then we sprinted out of the swamp as fast as we could and made our way back to one of the streets with the bars. We got a ride home and sobered up real quick. We tried figuring out what we heard so we could make a rational explanation. Anything we came up with wasn't good. Teresa came up with the idea to check out the swamp in the morning. During the day, she said we could safely navigate the area and see if there was anything to be worried about. I know I would never be able to navigate my way back to exactly where we were that night before, but Teresa's good like that. She's like a professional hiker, and she proved that by getting us to the exact spot we were hiding in the night before. All three of our indents were still in the dirt from where we were hiding. We all talked for a little bit about what direction we thought the screams came from, even though it was hard to pinpoint because of the way the scream echoed. We all surprisingly agreed on the same general direction. Teresa led the way through the thick brush. This wasn't like a normal path. We were basically walking through bushes and mud puddles. A few minutes later, Teresa gasped. On one of the tree branches was the sleeve of a denim jacket. Just the sleeve. On the ground below the torn sleeve was a bunch of different footprints in the mud, almost like it was a struggle of some kind. I was ready to go back, but Teresa pushed forward a little bit. Not far from the sleeve was a small opening surrounded by trees. On the ground was the rest of the denim jacket.
Surrounding the jacket were more of the footprints in the mud that looked like they were all bunched up in one spot, again making me feel like a struggle took place here. Leading away from the jacket was one set of footprints, and they led straight into more thick brush where it was impossible to track the footsteps anymore. I was done with all of this. I told Teresa and Will that I didn't feel safe anymore and that I wanted to go back to the house. They weren't as freaked out as me, but they were uneasy about all of this. We went back to the house, and I don't know why I let them talk me into this, but we agreed to just let it go. I was sure at that moment that we had witnessed some form of potential crime, but Will and Teresa didn't fully agree. They said it was possible, but most likely it was just a joke, or even more likely a coincidence that we found the code and just happened to hear screaming the night before. Will also convinced us that if we got law enforcement involved, we would be the only ones linked to the crime, if there was one, and that scared us, even though we clearly had nothing to hide. He made the point that it's possible the cops wouldn't believe 3 young adults were just in the middle of this random swampy area and witnessed a potential crime. Would they really believe that our drunk cousin just wandered into the swamp? If I could do it over, I would have called the police right after I heard the screams. At the time, I just thought Will made good points, and I thought it was best to just move on and forget about it. It's been several years now, and I still think about that scream. I've always wondered if I truly witnessed a crime, or if I just witnessed some intense domestic issue. I'm happy to get this story off my chest. It's been therapeutic in a way to share this. I hope nobody has to ever hear those kinds of screams in your lifetime, because you'll never forget them. This story I'm about to tell you happened to my girlfriend and I last summer. It was the first time we were able to travel together as a couple, and we were excited about it. She came with me one time on a family vacation, but that's not the same as being alone together, so this felt like a memorable and important next step. The trip ended up being memorable, but not for the right reasons. Not that anyone will ever find out who we are, but just in case, for privacy's sake, I'm going to refer to my girlfriend as Vanessa in the story. One important detail I need to point out in the very beginning is that Vanessa loves to remind me that I'm way too nice and generous when it comes to meeting people. She claims there's a difference between just being nice like a normal person and being like my version of nice, which is apparently treating every new person I meet like they're my best friend. Those are her words, not mine. I'm an overly friendly guy, and that's gotten me into trouble many times in my life, but only once did it almost cost me dearly. This story starts on the way down to Ocean City, Maryland. It's a fun little tourist town. It's basically just a large coastal town with a ton of condos, hotels, and restaurants, and it's all right on the ocean for the most part. I used to travel there with my family when I was a kid, and this was the first time I visited as an adult. When we were about 20 minutes away from the condo we would be staying at, I decided to pull over at a gas station and fill up the tank, as well as grab a few drinks. While I was inside, a guy who later introduced himself to me as Henry bumped into me. He turned around and started apologizing like crazy. I put my hands up and assured him that it was completely fine and probably my fault anyway. Henry was a good-looking guy. He was wearing a pink and black button-up shirt, and it was mostly unbuttoned. He had kind eyes, and he made direct eye contact while we were talking. He was probably in his late 20s if I had to guess, but I don't know for sure. We talked for a minute or two while we were in line, and I told him that we were headed to Ocean City. He lit up and told me that he and his girl were also heading to Ocean City. I got excited and told him the name of the condo that we were staying at, and he smiled and said he thinks he knows where that condo is, and he's pretty sure that they're located right near us. I was excited for this genuine interaction. I get excited meeting people and making friends. One of my weaknesses is not being able to see the flaws in people. I think it's a strength, but Vanessa thinks it's a weakness, even though she loves that about me. Henry asked me to exchange numbers, and I did without hesitation. I told him that I'd give him a call sometime during the week, and we could link up at the beach or maybe grab dinner one night. We gave each other a bro hug and went our separate ways. When I got back in the car, Vanessa knew right away that I must have made a new friend because of the way I was acting. I told her the story, and she just rolled her eyes. We got to the condo that afternoon and just had a relaxing evening in the room that night. Our room was on the 5th floor, and it overlooked the ocean. We sat on the balcony and admired the view until we went to bed. The next day, we went down to the beach early. We're both early risers, so getting up early is no issue. We set up our chairs a little after 7 in the morning and drank our coffee on the beach. A few hours later, I heard someone shout my name from behind me. I turned around, and Henry was waving at me with a woman following him. She was not like Henry. He was mirroring a lot of my mannerisms and energy, and she looked miserable. She was pale, most of her face was covered by these huge sunglasses, and the rest was shaded by a huge sun hat. She was also wearing leggings and a button-up long-sleeve shirt. She was also carrying this large tote bag that looked empty. This was a woman who did not like the sun. She didn't say much,
Henry introduced her as his woman friend, Sarah, and she just waved and gave an unenthusiastic smile. She was the opposite of the Henry I met the day before. After an awkward introduction, Henry asked if they could join us, and of course, we agreed. The more the merrier was always my motto. They didn't have chairs or beach gear. Henry just plopped himself in the sand while his woman friend stood there. I got up and offered her my chair, and she was hesitant for a second, but then took the seat. While we were sitting there, Henry told us they were staying in the building that was directly next to ours. My mind was blown. I couldn't even believe the odds of that happening. That was a major red flag for Vanessa, but not for me. We hung out for another hour or so, and then went back to the room. Before we left, Henry kept asking if we could all go out tonight for a drink, but I could tell Vanessa didn't want to, so I just told him I'd call him if we decided to go out. When we got back to the room, Vanessa started to tell me about all her concerns. She said that Henry seemed fake and that he was giving her major creep vibes. She also said that Sarah was one of the rudest humans she'd ever met. She complained about the sun the entire time. She also made a great point and said that she doesn't know anyone who comes to a beach town and hates the beach, and then yet goes down to the beach without bringing a chair, a towel, an umbrella, or anything. I told her she made great points and that I wouldn't call Henry the rest of the trip. The last thing I wanted was to ruin Vanessa's vacation. That night, I was sitting on the balcony smoking a cigar, even though that wasn't allowed. It was late, but I'm not sure of the time. I was looking down on the beach, and I swore I could see Sarah down there walking alone. I mean, she had the big tote bag, the big hat, and the same outfit from earlier. I was just too far away to be sure. I went back inside and got ready to call it a night. Vanessa was already in bed. I went to make sure the door was locked, and I thought I could hear someone talking coming from outside the door. This alone wouldn't be concerning, as there are several condos on the floor, but the talking sounded like it was coming from right outside my condo. I tried to listen, but it just sounded like incoherent mumbling. I got close to the door to check it was locked, and before I could grab the doorknob, I noticed it shook, as if someone was trying to open it from the other side. Instead of running or freaking out, I just politely shouted that they had the wrong room. I heard the sound of footsteps running away after I said that. I had just assumed that maybe somebody had mistakenly tried to get into the wrong room. After all, accidents happen. I stayed awake a little longer, just to make sure I didn't have another surprise guest. Nobody else came to the door, and I went to sleep. The next day, the same thing happened. Henry and Sarah seemingly came out of nowhere and joined us on the beach. They were wearing the same clothes again. Normally, that wouldn't be weird on the beach if you were wearing a bathing suit or something, but Henry and Sarah were not wearing bathing suits. He was still wearing the same outfit I saw him wearing at the gas station, and she was wearing the same outfit as the day before. We didn't spend a lot of time at the beach on this day. I could tell Vanessa was all done with these two. I politely told Henry that her and I were going to go back to the room for a while and then have a romantic dinner out. I told him that I'd text him if we were down to grab a drink later. He seemed overly excited for some reason and let us go. While we were getting ready to go out, I looked out the balcony and I saw Sarah standing on the ground where the beach meets the patio of the condo building. She wasn't facing the building, she was facing the ocean. It was weird that she was in front of our building and not where they were supposedly staying. But the weirdest thing was that Henry was nowhere to be found. She was by herself. I watched her for a little while, which made me feel like a creep. A few minutes went by, and Henry emerged from what looked like the bottom of our building. I watched him go over to Sarah. He started waving his hands around and then stormed off in the opposite direction from where they were staying. Sarah waited a few seconds and then followed him. That whole interaction felt weird, but who am I to judge? Once Vanessa was ready, we left the condo and went out to eat. While we were out, my phone kept ringing. It was Henry. I didn't answer it. After dinner, we started walking back to the condo since we were only a few blocks away. Henry called again. Vanessa told me to just text him back and tell him we're going to bed so he stops calling. So I texted him and said that we were walking back from dinner and that we were going to bed early. Immediately, my phone started ringing. It was Henry. I didn't answer. He finally sent a message that said, "Hey buddy, let's meet for a drink before you get back. It's too early to go to bed." Vanessa rolled her eyes, and even I was getting annoyed now. I responded with another text that said, "Thanks for the offer, but we're going to bed. We're already about to be at the condo." Then I got the weirdest text of all, a text that may have had some other implications. All it said was, "Don't go to your room yet." We both stopped and contemplated the text while standing in the parking lot of the condo. Henry was strange, but was he capable of something malicious? Vanessa thought so. We got to the room a few minutes later and noticed that the door was slightly open. I know for a fact that I did not leave the door open. Vanessa started to panic and she waited in the hall. I slowly entered the room and was relieved everything looked how we left it, at least at first. Then I started noticing things that weren't how we left them. The balcony door was open, but nobody was out there. In the bedroom, both of our suitcases were completely ransacked, and the only thing missing was a pair of Jordans I brought, Vanessa's bathing suit, and a picture of us that we had printed out and left on the dresser in the bedroom. We called the police and told them that we thought it might be Henry and Sarah who broke into our room, but those were almost for sure fake names. The condo next door had no record of a Henry staying there, and the only Sarah in the building was not that Sarah. When they tried to track the phone, it was no longer in service. The local police told us that it's not something that happens a lot in that town, but occasionally, some people will try to rob tourists. We were just some of the unlucky people who were chosen, I guess. The only thing I took from this experience is that I really need to be more careful about who I trust. And if anyone out there visits Ocean City, Maryland, just be careful, because somewhere out there, Henry and Sarah are still lurking.